G'day, mate. 40 here. Last night, as we all know, was Nitternacht, which is the Yiddish word for Christmas Eve. And in some Hasidic communities, it is the custom on Christmas Eve to abstain from study of Torah. So, you go, 40. What on earth can you possibly do on an evening where you're not supposed to study Torah? Well, I took this lying down, and I tried to distract myself, so I tuned into the Polygo app. It's the Netflix of textbooks, and I started listening to a classic book by the sociologist Randall Collins, called The Credential Society, an historical sociology of education and stratification, published in 1979. And one single sentence from this book just jumped out at me. So it's talking about lawyers and overcrowding in the legal profession, and it was raised constantly by elite lawyers in the late 19th century. And it primarily reflects efforts at status closure within the profession. Have you ever heard of the term status closure? It's just a great term. It hit me like a bolt from the heavens. Right? It just seems to explain so much of life. Right? You ever notice that the cool kids have a system to keep people like you on the outside looking in? Now, I grew up a preacher's kid. I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist. I grew up around many a Christian evangelist. And as a result, I have a weakness for martyr narratives. Right? I love a story where I can tell myself, I am the good guy who's being nailed to a cross by bad guys, but through my suffering, I am going to redeem the world. And then I try to spiritually elevate and take on the attitude of, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, I didn't choose this self-destructive biochemical rush, right? It's a product of my genes and my childhood, right? I'm the victim here, right? At every point in my life, I've done the best I could with the tools I've had. So the most talked about essay in 2025 is A Story of Victimhood, The Lost Generation by Jacob Savage. It's about overt discrimination against young white men and how access to prestigious careers was systematically restricted for a specific cohort, white male millennials, to redistribute opportunities to other demographic groups. And this has really been going on since the 1960s, but it just became particularly intense in 2014. So this is the author, Jacob Savage, 8 months ago, talking about another one of his essays, The Vanishing White Male Writer.
So thanks for joining me, Jacob, and for contributing this piece.
Sure, happy to, and thanks for publishing it.
So this piece, I'd say, qualifies as quite viral, which is a particularly impressive achievement in these days when things don't really or links to articles don't go viral on Twitter anymore by design. The social media space is much more fragmented, et cetera. So it's a harder thing to achieve than it was in the 2010s. But this piece did circulate and make the rounds and get discussed quite a lot. So congrats on that. I'm just curious, what you make of that. What was it that hit a nerve about that, about this piece in this particular moment, and sort of worked against, I guess, the kind of antiviral structures that seem to dominate the internet now?
I think people sort of everyone wants confirmation of how they feel about things, and anything that sort of marshals some statistics.
Yeah, I love that. That's the number one reason I try to study the world, because I sense something's going on, but I can't quite put words to it, and I want to see if someone else has got a better explanation. I think that explains the appeal of pundits and gurus and simplifiers, or people who can just take the big buzzing confusion of reality out there and boil it down in a way that is understandable to me and say meets my social, psychological needs. Right, makes me feel clearer and better about reality.
Statistical claim to.
I mean, one reason I just love Dennis Prager is that he takes all these confusing things and often is able to just boil them down to very simple narratives of good versus evil. And it meets my needs.
Something, I think, has a lot more power than, we're sort of in the golden age of vibes pieces. And, just sort of like, this is happening, I feel it. But I guess, what...
Whoa, was that some kind of subtle slam on women that they're producing a lot of vibes pieces, but he's producing like some male data-centered piece?
I think there was an appetite, I think, to just be shown the thing that you are, internally feeling. And I think that's why it went viral, although, like, I don't know how any of this stuff actually works.
Yeah, so it's worth noting you do begin the piece, and obviously people should check it out on the Compact site if they haven't already, but you begin it by kind of laying out some numbers. And I'm sort of curious what, at what point did you start sort of trying to run the numbers on this set of phenomena, and, what motivated that on your end?
So this is something I've been thinking about for a while, and mainly not actually in the field of literature. I had a sort of much longer article I've been plotting and not writing about white male millennials. And sort of randomly, I was like having a conversation with an editor friend of mine, and she was like, there's no white male millennial. I think we were talking about Long Island Compromise, and it just occurred that I think sort of both of us, that there were no white male millennial novelists that you could sort of think of or had written anything. I mean, there were.
So how did this happen? And looking at this essay by Jacob Savage, The Lost Generation, he identifies 2014 as the hinge year where diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives became just dominant in our leading institutions, particularly the high-status institutions like Hollywood and academia and journalism. And so hiring practices explicitly shifted in 2014 to deliberately exclude young white men, in particular, from entry and mid-level positions. So white men in lower-level TV writing jobs dropped from about 50% in 2011 to 12% in 2024. And what makes this so socially devastating is that it produced a dramatic drop in quality, in excellence, in social trust, and in social cohesion. So our leading institutions used all these social justice mandates to justify this overt racial discrimination. And so they created an invisible curriculum and explicit hiring biases, so we can't have an all-white male room. So people were no longer primarily hired on the basis of merit. They were primarily hired on the basis of meeting diversity quotients. Now, the essay also illustrates a profound generational divide. So you had the insiders, older white men, boomers, Gen X, who already held tenure or held executive positions. They were largely unaffected, though they have been systematically racially discriminated against since affirmative action took off in the 1960s. Those who climbed to the top of the greasy pole largely held on to their status and largely held on to their power. And the cost of this status closure was borne almost entirely by young white men. Right? The mandates to diversify didn't fall primarily on older white men. They landed on younger white men. So older white men who achieved power, right, they learned to protect their own status by restricting young white men from entering. Right? They effectively sacrificed the younger generation of their own group to satisfy institutional pressures. And prestige itself became a resource that was re-monopolized. So tenure-track positions for white men fell dramatically. High-status outlets like The Atlantic and The New York Times shifted hiring so that white men, effectively young white men, shouldn't even bother applying. So this status closure played out as a zero-sum game in professional markets. And young white men, the lost generation, found the doors to status attainment locked through this combination of new institutional morals and the self-preservation of the older white ruling class. So we have status closure that destroys institutional quality and social trust. Right? The status closure erodes excellence because excellence and individual merit and talent have been subordinated to all these demographic priorities. So we've had a systematic exclusion of qualified candidates based on their racial identity rather than ability. So elite decision makers learn to bypass the best person for the job to meet the diversity goals. So you have editors confessing, it was a given we were not going to hire the best person. It was jarring how we would talk about excluding white guys. Jeffrey Goldberg said that it takes tremendous skill to write a long-form cover story for The Atlantic, and that the people with these skills are almost exclusively white males. But in his hiring, he skewed heavily towards women and people of color, and deliberately pivoting away from merit in favor of representation. And then in the academy, the impact was equally stark. So white men who were often clearly the strongest candidate were explicitly not hired on the basis of their race. Because from the top, there are all these explicit racial mandates to avoid selecting white men.
Or that you could think of, but that had written anything zeitgeisty. And so I sort of like got into it and then got really sort of deeper and deeper into the weeds. And I was sort of surprised at how, as someone who sort of already knew this, I was also surprised at how sort of complete the lack of, any output that seems to have made any cultural mark of our generation.
So, I suppose one genre of response to the piece was one that you sort of anticipate in it, which is, why should we care? And, you speak to people who themselves could arguably be construed as sort of the victims of this marginalization or the casualties of it, at least. And, some of them sort of say to you, well, why should I feel sorry for myself? Why should we care? This is some sort of...
So this overt racial discrimination stifled excellence, and it fractured social cohesion and social trust, because people who thought that excellence was the way to demonstrate your efforts and your abilities, and that merit and hard work would be rewarded, found out that would not work if you're a young white man. So this created resentment, anger, isolation, division, right? So what was billed as inclusive progress became a zero-sum game of identity-based exclusion. So DEI-driven cultures fostered all these performative allyship, where older white men adopted allyship mindset and protective coloration to survive, thus alienating those unwilling or unable to conform. Diversity training introduced all sorts of DEI and subculture language and public shaming tactics, such as women clapping back or snapping fingers in group chats during Zoom calls. So the work atmosphere shifted from collaborative to race-based adversarial and ideologically rigid and racially rigid interactions. So white men increasingly felt out of place in our leading institutions. So one white liberal guy says, I always thought I was an effeminate nerd growing up, but now my way of expressing myself puts me on the most masculine end of men in media. So elite environments narrowed the range of acceptable expressions of identity and excluded all those who didn't fit the new stereotype. So there were all sorts of downfield results, all right, all sorts of delayed life milestones. Life got put on hold, career instability, fostered a sense of betrayal, disorientation among millennials entering the workforce expecting meritocracy, but encountering explicit anti-white discrimination. So older white men generally held on to power without facing the same barriers. Younger white men bore the brunt, creating more and more skepticism towards America's leading institutions. So white men stopped applying to unwelcoming fields, demographic shifts reshaped narratives and stories, and young white men who were excluded, they didn't want to talk about what was happening because it was just too shameful. So there was a profound shift in how power and prestige were distributed, not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of how well you can play the allyship game and whether you're of the right protected social class. So people retreated back to blood. People became increasingly tribal and skeptical, and people felt like they had less and less in common with their fellow Americans. Remember, diversity means we have less and less in common. If you say diversity is great, you're saying it's great that we have less and less in common. In Los Angeles, it seems like about half the population can't speak English. So it's hard to foster much social cohesion when you can't even talk to each other.
Reshuffling that, reverses years in which the underrepresentation went in the other direction. So, what's the big deal? And you anticipate and discuss that response in the piece. Of course, inevitably, people nevertheless, shared it just kind of with the headline, but didn't really, necessarily read any further. So, how do you sort of answer that, that response?
I mean, I think that the reason we should care isn't, I mean, if you're one of the affected people, I think it's sort of inhuman to say like, you shouldn't care. But okay, on a broader social, cultural level, is the world that much worse because there aren't any white male millennial novelists of note? Probably not. But you want an art that sort of deals honestly with the world around it. And I really do maintain that this is bad for everyone. You know, I think I just want, you know, people to be honest in art. I don't want a white male identitarian fiction niche. I want people to be able to write what they want and write creatively and, you know, do things that are interesting. And I feel like this is more a symptom of a culture that, you know, a stuck culture that doesn't do things that are interesting than anything else.
Yeah, and you know, here it's perhaps worth getting into the later part of the piece. You do sort of analyze a few writers who do, you know, fall into this niche and have achieved at least some degree of visibility.
Now, it burns people up when those who achieve visibility and success and status are turning out poor quality work
in recent years. And you know, so part of what you're offering is a critique of
and the awkward host of this conversation is Jeff Schellenberger.
Of those writers who do kind of fall into this category who are active today. And so, you know, it seemed to me part of the piece also just came out of your reading those authors.
Yeah, I think what happened partly is I read Tony Tula Tumute's novel, which I loved. And I was like, and it sort of occurred to me that this novel could not have been written by a white man. Like, it just could not have been published. It would not have received if it had been published, say, by a tiny press, I don't think anyone would have deigned to give it attention. And I thought that it was a great novel. And, you know, and I was like, why, you know, you sort of think, okay, like, it's weird, you know, he can write, you know, sort of a female white character. He can write.
So it used to be that musicians applying for a job with an orchestra, they would audition behind a screen so that there couldn't be any overt discrimination. But when this did not result in enough numbers of certain demographics in orchestras, then they changed it to deliberately favor certain racial demographics and make selections of who is going to get these prestigious slots, not on the basis of excellence, but on the basis of fulfilling explicit diversity quotas.
Like a Thai character, he can write a white male character. And I think that like a white man of his, you know, and he's incredibly talented. I think there are very few white men writers who would be as talented as he is. But, you know, there are probably a few out there. I don't think they could get away with it. And I think in a world in which, you know, you are these sort of creative possibilities are foreclosed, everyone is sort of.
I grew up a preacher's kid, and there were other kids in the class who were just constantly telling on me. And I remember my brother had this experience where he told a risque joke to a group of his female classmates, and they laughed and laughed. They roared with appreciation and asked for more. So he told them more jokes, and when he'd run out of jokes and when they'd stopped laughing, they went to the teacher and turned him in. And I was turned in all the time by other kids for swearing or for any deviation from the good preacher's kid Seventh-day Adventist way of life. My own attitude has been to never turn someone into authority. That just goes against my ethos. And so people who are more stoical and don't report people for these sort of infractions, they lose in this game where there are all these incentives to turn people in for crime think.
Worse off for it in the end.
You know, what's your overall sense of the writers you do discuss in the piece? You know, what, and I suppose in terms of that criterion of honesty or, you know, showing us the world around us, like in what way do they fall short as you see it?
I mean, I think there are different ways of falling short, and I think that it's possible to not fall short and just completely ignore the world around you and write a fantastic novel. But I think that...
Yeah, but it's hard to produce works of art that are in denial of reality. right? The most profound art reveals reality. And if you're in denial of reality, what are you going to reveal?
Just sort of in the choice of stuff that people do. Like, I think the other thing that I read that I think crystallized my thinking on this was alongside Tony Tumute's book. I read a couple of the chapters from Ben Shattuck's book, which is honestly probably the worst book I've ever read.
Right. When I read the most praised books by the New York Times, or when I see the list, there's usually a strong bias against straight white male authors and a strong bias in the favor of gay narratives and black narratives.
And there's this, like, it reeks of wanting to be liked in this way that is so, I think, poisonous to.
Right. When people are abasing themselves to be liked under this new DEI hierarchy, it's kind of sickening.
You've said things like black women are biologically different than white women.
Yes, they have different fertility windows. They have a higher rate of fertility complications, 50%
But there's
higher
no
rate.
scientific evidence to prove that a black woman and a white woman are genetically different, right? This is like...
What are you talking
This is
about?
according, No.
Like literally, there are genes that code for their skin color. There are genes that...
Again, this is like government data. This is ME, right? This is the National Institute of Health. This is the American Medical Association. Like, there is no scientific evidence to prove that.
And that's a big problem, right? Because a lot of it...
That's nonsense. Different peoples, right, have different interactions with different medications. That there are different readings for various blood tests that are more or less dangerous for different groups, right? We evolved in different circumstances. We have different strengths and vulnerabilities.
No, there's no scientific
and that's why I asked.
Like IQ differences. Black people are genetically different from other populations.
And I'll say that again. There is no scientific evidence to prove that, right? And as people
I'm sorry. I'm stating. Do you want to ask an AI if there's scientific evidence to prove that?
No, I want to ask.
Because
this is
what you're
purely based
stating
on
is just factually incorrect. Humans are genetically diverse. It's not a bad thing that humans are genetically diverse.
I'm not saying it's a bad or a good thing. I'm saying there is no scientific evidence.
And I'm saying that is a factually...
And he's saying that there is scientific evidence.
There is scientific evidence. There is overwhelming scientific evidence.
And this
basics... No. This is like saying the sky is not blue. Like, it is genes that code their skin color, right? Those genes are obviously different in them than they are in us. How is that not science? That's just like a basic fact. The genes that code their skin color, their level of melanin production, are different from my genes that code melanin production.
And that's precisely why I was asking this question, because I think for some people that do believe, like you, that people are genetically different, that has historically been used to promote racial hierarchies, right? And that's why I'm asking you, because you do.
Right. Different groups evolved in different circumstances, have different strengths and weaknesses, different vulnerabilities, often have different reactions to medications. Right. Sickle cell anemia is not evenly distributed between all groups. And as Dr. Sally Satel wrote in the New York Times, if you're a doctor and you don't take into account race, then you are practicing terrible medicine. Because different racial groups will often have different reactions to medication and will need understanding of their various and varying challenges, vulnerabilities, and strengths. Not a lot of great things are done in denial of reality.
To art, and it's just, you can sort of picture the creative writing center at Iowa in which, like, someone.
I mean, just look at the Premier League. It's the #1 soccer league in the world. And it has become so much higher quality soccer, so much more intense, so much faster. All right. With the inclusion of more and more black players, they have brought a whole new level of quality to the game because they bring special gifts. Every people has special gifts.
One's like, yeah, I'm going to write like a story, like an Alan Lomax, but gay story. In which nothing happens, in which like everyone is nice to each other. And the idea that and for me that, I mean, like, I think a lot of the other examples are like some of those books are very good, but, much narrower in scope. but to me, that book, I was just like, this is the purest symptom of this malaise that we have. Like it just, there could be no worse book. If you like want to teach, if the academy still exists in 100 years and you wanted to sort of explain the 2010s, I almost would recommend that book as like a way of getting into the, a sort of poisonous cultural rot. Anyway, sorry, Ben.
I was curious what you made of the film American Fiction, which was quite successful and seemed to at least, it was one sort of indicator of the ongoing vibe shift, I suppose, because interestingly, it actually.
So the wider culture took a right-wing turn in 2024 prior to Trump's election, right? Donald Trump's election was much more a manifestation of an American cultural shift than so much a cause of this shift. And this particular movie and the novel is based on, illustrates this culture shift.
Is based on this novel, Erasure, that came out roughly 20 years prior, I believe. I can't remember exactly when it was first released, like late 90s, early 2000s, but the Percival Everett novel.
2001.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So American Fiction, it's just a delicious movie. It's about I think an Ivy League black professor who, as a joke, decides to write the type of street narrative that publishers love to put out about black life. And to his horror, it becomes a major bestseller.
So it's actually more responding to this like 90s moment of political correctness, I suppose, in its original formulation. But then when it's released as a film in 2023, I believe it sort of, it's an opportunity to start making fun of the sort of.
So one manifestation of this general war on excellence is this particular hatred of Jews. So different groups have different interests, and just because someone has some negative feelings about Jews doesn't mean that they loathe excellence. But sometimes it is primarily just a hatred of excellence. And so what we see in this clip, one of the parties represented in Norway's parliament, the Socialist Left Party, chose this week to light a public menorah in central Oslo for the people of Palestine and the victims there. So a Jewish symbol tied to the holiday of Hanukkah, deliberately appropriated to advance an anti-Jewish, anti-Israel agenda, right? The very same week that Jews were massacred in Australia. So this is where much of the elite political culture stands right now, not just in Norway, but throughout the West. Since the 1960s, dominant elite culture has increasingly sided with those who can be described as victims of white colonialism. And so anything that the victims of white colonialism do is morally excused, and anything that advanced civilizations do to try to protect themselves, then that is severely restricted by international human rights law.
Doug Wilson. He knows Doug Wilson because Doug Wilson has made a name for himself partly by saying outrageous things about slavery, about women's suffrage, about all these, about Christian nationalism. Shortest answer to what is Christian nationalism is don't make God angry. So you have all this Doug Wilson stuff, which gets all this attention. Of course, it draws Sam Harris like a moth to the flame, and you can decide who the moth and who the flame is. And so they get into it. And, of course, their conversation goes nicey, 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 nicey. Sam Harris basically lets Doug Wilson say everything he wants to say. And at the end of the conversation, Doug Wilson basically says, this was a wonderful conversation. My conversations usually don't go this well. You listened very politely to everything that I had to say. And for Sam Harris, that's because everything that Doug Wilson has to say is crazy town. So why wouldn't he let Doug Wilson say all of his crazy town stuff? Because that's what Sam Harris thinks of Doug Wilson. And that's what Sam Harris thinks of Doug Wilson's project. And so Sam Harris is going to let Doug Wilson say all of his things because all of Sam Harris's audience is going to say he's a crazy man. He's reading this Iron Age book and yada, yada, yada. Hence that little first video. I'll try and find all the videos in the Doug Wilson playlist, because that first video that I made in response to the first 20 minutes, I said, Doug Wilson is not thinking about Sam Harris's audience. Sam Harris is thinking about his own audience, and many people said Doug Wilson never thinks about anybody else's audience anyway. Doug Wilson knows exactly who his audience is, and Doug Wilson says exactly what his audience wants to hear, and hence we got the idea of the two basketball teams playing each other, but instead neither team plays any defense because they both get to dunk on the other team just repeatedly and repeatedly, and that's that shtick. Now, it's really interesting the way this conversation starts, and I really hope we get to see the whole thing, because right away it sort of goes to AI, and AI is just the it is just the conversation of today. It's AI doomerism, and so Ross Douthat basically
Judaism is probably the most optimistic of the major monotheist religions, certainly in its faith in human potential and its openness to technological advances. So many traditional Jews are quite open to all sorts of changes in technology and in, say, stem cell research that are considered anathema, particularly by Catholics. It seems like Catholics tend to be the most tech skeptical, and even traditional Jews, by and large, tend to be the most open to techno-optimism and just open in general to the potential for human development and human goodness. So the more religious you are, the more skeptical you will tend to be of human nature, but there is a strong strain, in particular in Judaism, in an openness to the potential for human goodness. So I remember at the start of COVID, seeing tweets, what are public health officials occupied with these days? And they were primarily occupied, it seemed, I'm sure this is in large part a caricature, but they seemed to be largely occupied with a woke agenda. And then after George Floyd, you had all these public health officials who were telling people to stay home, stay isolated, then saying, but it's good to get out and get social and get on the streets if it's for a woke cause. And so COVID hits, and public health officials start telling people what to do, but they had burned their social capital with their woke agenda, right? We had a competence crisis and the trust thermocline. So a thermocline is when you have one temperature layer on top of the water, and then you just go a little deeper, right? And there is a dramatic temperature change, right, with depth, right? It doesn't happen gradually. It happens suddenly. So you had all these institutions like the CDC and various parts of the public health agenda and the New York Times, right, who were used to taking people's trust for granted, and they would use their position to push an unpopular agenda, and they had the illusion of stability because people were grumbling, but they didn't leave, and they just stayed put because of habit and lack of alternatives, and they overestimated their brand loyalty. And then suddenly something happens, and they encounter the thermocline, right? A specific event acts as the final straw. So all the public health officials who are telling people to stay home and stay isolated and practice social distancing, then the George Floyd riots come out, and they say, get out on the streets and protest for social justice, and people get pushed past their limit. And they don't just get slightly angry, they just leave entirely, they never come back. Right? Once something happens, many people just switch to a done mindset, right? They're no longer interested in negotiation, right? They have emotionally divested. So institutions mistook the silence of the done users for satisfaction, but in reality, the users were silent because they simply stopped caring enough to campaign, right? They're just waiting for their contract to expire or an alternative to appear. So public health officials spent years engaging in liberal activism. The public grumbled, but they still trusted the CDC brand because of decades of accumulated capital. Then COVID hits, George Floyd riots hit, and our public health leaders endorsed the protest as health positive while condemning other gatherings, such as Christian gatherings, as health negative. And so they pushed a huge segment of the population, particularly populists and conservatives, past the thermal layer. And trust didn't slowly erode, it just collapsed. Right? And so this demographic simply stopped listening to anything the officials said, even on unrelated topics like vaccine. So they went from skeptical to done. And once you pass this thermocline, right, you cannot climb back up. Right? Once the citizen realizes, you don't care about my health, you don't care about me, you only care about your status and your ideology, the spell is broken, right? No amount of new PR campaigns or apologies can restore the previous state of naive trust. The institution is now permanently viewed as a hostile actor. For tens of millions of Americans, their interactions with America's dominant institutions are negative. From flying into LAX and going through customs, bad experience. Getting on public transport, another bad experience. Going to the DMV, another bad experience. Dealing with any government agency, bad experience. Dealing with HR or dealing with diversity hiring and overt racial discrimination against young white men. You pile on negative experience after negative experience until you have a whole generation just checking out and becoming Nick Fuentes fans.
Sam Harris basically starts off saying, well, what are you worried about? I'm worried about AI. And Ross Douthat basically says, look, what's happening right now is that we are increasingly creating a system by which human culture and human reproduction is increasingly being derailed by our attention bots that are sucking us into a very fruitless world where we are no longer making culture, we are no longer making babies, we are no longer sort of continuing to progress human society.
So when I go back to Australia, it is such a cultural shift because most people in Australia feel the government is on their side. For non-liberals in America, there's not a sense the government is on their side. Most people in Australia seem to feel that their dominant institutions of their society are on their side. You don't sense that in America among people in the center and the right. So in 2020, American public health leaders treated their authority like some kind of infinite resource that they could just spend on promoting a woke agenda. So a genuine biological COVID crisis hits, and they need to spend that capital on saving lives, and they found that their account with tens of millions of Americans was overdrawn. That they released this open letter in June 2020. Over 1,200 public health experts come out and say, when it comes to George Floyd protests, don't worry about social distancing. Don't worry about the dangers of viral transmission of COVID. Right? These George Floyd protests, they're vital to national public health because racism is a health crisis. But any anti-lockdown protests or Christian gatherings, those are dangerous. So this was state disclosure in its rawest form. Right? Our leading public health experts who'd signed such a letter, they admitted that any commitment to truth and science was subordinate to their political agenda. So they burned their capital on these woke beliefs to promoting health equity and social justice. So by promoting these woke beliefs, it was a costly signal, show how loyal they were to the elite coalition, but they alienated tens of millions of their fellow Americans. And so when they then turned to the public and says, trust us, wear a mask, take the vaccine, the public heard, trust us. Same people who told you racism is a virus, but your church service is a biohazard, no, thank you. Right? The trust thermocline had broken. Right? State disclosure relies on the illusion of neutrality. We listen to doctors, we listen to scientists, we listen to experts when we believe that they are expert and we believe that they care about the truth and about expertise. When people realize that those who build themselves as caring about truth and expertise and excellence and the public good were really pushing a left-wing agenda, a self-interested agenda, right? Their mandates lost moral force. And the losers in the status hierarchy, the populists correctly identified that the science had been weaponized to punish them, to punish those who wanted to go to church and who are operating small businesses while rewarding the elite's lifestyle, right? The protests and essential Hollywood productions. So with the anti-white discrimination, we increasingly had an anti-excellence agenda of our leading institutions. They became so obsessed with the invisible curriculum of equity, they forgot that their primary job was preventing infection, and this created a catastrophic loss of competence. And Mike Benz would argue this is where the censorship industrial complex went into overdrive during COVID, right? People in authority realized suddenly that they had burned their credibility. They couldn't persuade the public anymore. They had lost their authority, so they resorted to censorship to silence the public and censor disinformation about the lab leak to try to maintain control. So public health elites spent their capital on the woke agenda. They expected a return on investment in status, but when the bill came due in social trust, they were absolutely bankrupt.
In whatever way you imagine progress, and we are, in a certain sense, destroying ourselves. Now, a little bit later, Douthat will say, I don't think that this will actually destroy human beings, but I think this is a huge derailment and distraction, and this is what I'm anxious about. And I couldn't believe what Sam Harris said. I was shocked. I thought, I've listened to a lot of Sam Harris. I know what Sam Harris basically says. He basically says, look, human beings are pretty simple. We're basically a split creature, and our lower half, our bodily existence, as long as you satiate us with our physical desires and then somehow keep the mind involved in the playground of psychedelics and meditation, and I have an app for that, Sam Harris says. In other words...
So there are many stories that we tell ourselves about race and gender, especially in the academy, and Jacob Savage notes this in his essay, that one thing that everyone agrees on is it's best not to talk about this overt anti-white, anti-male discrimination. You shouldn't say so in public. You shouldn't put your name attached. The humanities are so small, right, that you say the wrong thing, you're automatically understood to be a bad person. Though it was a shock when David Austin Walsh, a Yale postdoc student, a left-wing Twitter personality, he decided to detonate any chance he had at a career with a single tweet. He says, I'm 35 years old, I'm a 4 years post-PhD, and I'm also a white dude. Combine these factors together, and I am unemployable as a 20th century American historian. And then there was a pile-on that was swift and vicious. Right? It didn't matter that he was telling the truth. What mattered were the optics. So you find all these anecdotes in Jacob's essays where there's a social process of state disclosure, so that access to prestigious positions is simply blocked to most young white men. Right? There's the author, Jacob Savage. Right? He spent years and years paying his dues. He finally gets a break when a showrunner wants to hire him, but a white male executive blocks the hire, explaining the writer's room is already too white. They can't have an all-white male room, even if that might be the most excellent writer's room. So Jacob Savage follows the traditional meritocratic path, but the rules of entry have changed on him, right? And the incumbent, the executive, is trying to protect his own position by closing the door on the new entrant to meet a diversity quota. You have this left-wing journalist, Andrew, in new media, finds his career stalls because he's white. You can't even get interviewed at places like The Atlantic. Right? There's a new diversity metric that filters him out. Right? His kind are explicitly racially discriminated against. You have the editor-in-chief of New York Magazine who has to apologize to his staff for being another white man, promises to move the needle on diversity hiring. So anything that is pro-diversity is simultaneously anti-white. Right? This is the cool kind of racial discrimination. And so for many white men, older white men with power to maintain their own high status position, they agree to enforce closure against future members of his own group, young white men. They don't get hired. So you have all these search committees that will admit that white men are categorically excluded from the hiring pool regardless of merit. You have an Ivy League professor, Will, a millennial, serves on hiring committees, and he recognizes that his committee simply will not hire a white man. You have a classic scholar with a background at Yale Law who watches his career prospects vanish, and he recognizes that white men are simply not going to be hired. So it is possible to use state disclosure in a pro-social way when you use it to ensure competence. But this overt anti-white, anti-male discrimination decreases competence, decreases trust, and I think it's a significant reason why American institutions receive much less appreciation and trust from the public, because the product that they put out has severely declined in quality due to this anti-white, anti-male discrimination.
Make sure your body has everything it needs, and make sure your brain has everything it needs, and a human being from 0 to 80 or 90 or 100 can live a good life as long as the politics are aligned, so that we, in a sense, continue to just have our sense of negative utilitarianism. A great example of how negative utilitarianism has become sort of the dominant religion of the West. I found I turn on YouTube and say, let's watch something different. And TLDR News Global, I don't know who they are, but it was like, why China's irritating its trading partners. So I'm going to hear about trade imbalances and tariffs and all of this. And it was a fine video all the way through. And then I got to the ad at the end, and usually I'll just, click out of the ad, but no, we have a religious ad in this, but it's not religious in the sense that Sam Harris thinks about religion. It's religious in this sense. Here we go. Let's just play the ad.
Ridiculous readers. That's because GiveWell has spent 18 years researching global health and poverty alleviation and only directs funding to the highest impact opportunities they've found. These are things like preventative medication for malaria. It costs about $7 to provide a child with malaria treatment through the high malaria season. These treatments can reduce the number of malaria infections and, with enough treatments, also save a life in expectation. Over 150,000 donors have already trusted GiveWell to direct more than 2.5.
Okay, so what is this basically? Basically, this is an organization which probably is helping to sponsor this video, or maybe he's doing it for free out of the religious altruism of his heart that basically says we want to relieve suffering in places of the world. Now, this is not an idea antithetical to Christianity. Crystal, not Billy Crystal, the comedian, the other Crystal who wrote for the New York Times, a few years ago, he had a really interesting piece about all of the Christian doctors in Africa who are alleviating suffering, and these doctors.
So people will make the most extraordinary sacrifices if they are religiously inspired. Religion and strong in-group identity in general tends to promote an ethos of self-sacrifice because you so strongly identify with other people. Now, in the current zeitgeist, particularly in publishing that is dominated by feminism and a woke agenda, white men are effectively banned from writing about their own lives, right? They can't write about it honestly because they'll be labeled toxic. So the resulting literature that is published is dull, is humorless, is performative, right? Where white men are only allowed to exist if they become villains, if they become terrorists, right? The system has evolved to effectively prohibit any complex human portrayal of white men. So you have a literary landscape that lacks honesty, lacks brutality, lacks vitality. And you have a whole generation of young white men who are stranded on the wrong side of history. There's a telling anecdote about a maniac writer texting photos of the Queens of the Jungle Book. Right? So young white male novelist takes his toddler son to a bookstore. The child wants a book about whales or about trucks, but the prominent bookstore display is for a book called Queens of the Jungle, Meet the Female Animals Who Rule the Animal Kingdom. So normal male reaction would be to roll your eyes, but the maniac reaction is to text a photo of the display to a group chat, and then the hero liberal reaction is tell the toddler that gender isn't even a thing and buy the book because NPR recommends it. So this is the psychological alienation that results from this overt racially discriminatory state disclosure, right? You will privately mock this kind of display, right? You recognize how stupid it is, but in public, all you can do is support it.
Doctors are getting these, degrees which cost a lot of money to get in the United States. And instead of making all of that cash in the United States, having their best life now, instead they are going to Africa and they are serving the poor in Africa to alleviate suffering. But again, in some ways, I think this is downstream of the post-war consensus. This is downstream of what happened in terms of American religious history, sort of spread out globally. We are about relieving suffering. And of course, other religions, talked about relieving the poor too and serving the poor, et cetera, et cetera. The Christianity does not have the corner on that idea by any means, but this is sort of, you don't need any dogma. You don't need to believe in anything. Well, actually you are believing in something.
I came to the United States in 1977, and America by and large was a pro-Christian country. Then by the 1990s, America became increasingly neutral. There are parts of America that are still strongly pro-Christian. Then in the elite and coastal areas, there was much more overt hostility to Christianity. And then effectively with the gay marriage decision from the Supreme Court, that ushered in the anti-Christian era in which we now live. So Christopher Caldwell does not use the term state disclosure in his last book, The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. But his book is effectively a history of how there's been a massive state-sponsored elite system of state disclosure against white men in particular, and how that developed in America. Right, so we've moved from one system of closure that was racially discriminatory in favor of white men to another system of closure that would racially discriminate against white men. We had the development of a rival and consequential civil rights constitution that effectively became a second rival and even more powerful constitution on top of the original 1788 constitution. So 1788 constitution focused on negative liberty, freedom from the state, and then the Civil Rights Constitution focused on all these positive rights, freedom to particular outcomes. And this explicitly authorized the state to increasingly intervene in people's private lives and private associations to ensure specific group outcomes. So the 1964 Constitution became a tool for state disclosure. It gave various protected specific groups, various protected classes, the legal power to fight back against the old hierarchy. And it required a new form of exclusionary closure, the explicit exclusion of the former majority white men to balance the scales. So we had a new constitutional civil rights order built on permanent unpaid debt. The old America, particularly white men, owed a debt to the new America that could never be fully repaid. As long as there are any statistical disparities, right, then the debt was unpaid and further government intervention was justified. So you had a moral, social, and legal justification for anti-white, anti-male, anti-meritocratic hiring. So you had this system based on debt repayment, and hiring a less qualified candidate over a white male wasn't a failure of excellence, it was a debt payment. So you had a lost generation of white male millennials effectively becoming the currency used to pay the debts incurred by their grandfathers. And who enforced this? The bureaucracy, the civil rights industrial complex, HR departments, compliance officers, diversity deans. You had bureaucratic closure. And Christopher Caldwell's quite pessimistic because he views this conflict as zero-sum. You cannot have both freedom of association, the 1788 Constitution, and the mandated inclusion, the 1964 Civil Rights conclusion. One must win, one must lose. So some competitions in life are zero-sum, right? Sometimes one group will monopolize resources, and to do that, another group must be excluded. So now, leading up to the election of Donald Trump, you had an excluded America, a bullied America, an America that felt that it was consistently on the losing side, decide to fight back.
You know, broad Great Awakening in terms of how it affected literature and the publishing industry and so on. And it seems to be, or it seems to signal a shift away from the pieties of the at least peak sort of 2010s moment.
This is Jacob Savage.
And, you know, I suppose one thing that's kind of interesting about it in terms of your analysis is it is kind of about this question of honesty, where, you know, the on one hand, what they want from the writer, at the center of it is this kind of ludicrous performance of supposed honesty about his, you know, about a sort of stereotyped version of his racial plight and
his white privilege. So this idea of state disclosure comes from Max Weber's sociology, and he would describe how various social groups maintain their privilege by restricting access to rewards and opportunities to just people like them. And so this state disclosure takes two distinct currents. There's exclusion, the most common form where a dominant group constructs barriers to prevent outsiders from accessing their resources. This is done through rigid caste laws or explicit segregation and credentialism, right? The requirement of specific, expensive, and time-consuming degrees that signal that you're a member of the elite class. Much of education, simply an education in compliance and submission. And some groups are just much more willing to color within the lines to move ahead. And other groups, particularly men, much more rebellious and less likely to simply submit and comply. Then there's usurpation, upward closure, right? This is the reaction from the excluded. This is populism. This is the MAGA movement, right? Subordinate groups want power back, so they will engage in collective bargaining, in unionization, or create a political movement that demands a return to respect and power. So in modern advanced liberal democratic societies, explicit discrimination is usually illegal, But state disclosure has simply become more subtle and psychological. So people will be excluded on the basis of cultural capital and just not a good fit. So any hesitancy about celebrating gay marriage, it shows that you're a bad fit for all sorts of elite institutions. So elite firms get to hire based on cultural fit, which is a proxy for shared background, mannerisms, and hobbies. Right? And so plenty of people who have the skills but lack the polish or the thick social signals of this elite group will not get hired or stay hired. And it often boils down to the airport test. Would you feel comfortable being stuck at an airport with this person? Then there are all these linguistic shibboleths where if people don't use the latest in-group dialect, it shows that there's something wrong with you. You don't know the current correct phrasing, right? You're signaling that you're not part of the inner circle. So it's justified to exclude you as a bad person. And then there are all these bureaucratic moats, all these licenses for professions, right, where existing practitioners get to reduce competition and artificially inflate their status and wages. Right? So people who succeed often draw up the bridge behind them. Right? Once they enter a high status group, they become the most ardent defenders of closure mechanisms to keep other people out.
Then, but what that expectation forces him into is this, deception and fraud, which, is sort of the source of the humor. But in any case, I was just wondering, what you made of that film, both, the film itself, but also like what it signaled about the direction of the culture.
I mean, I think that film, I actually thought I thought I was going to dislike the critique part of the film. I actually enjoyed that. And I thought that the sort of personal stuff, which seemed like left over from the novel, was the weak point. But I think there are a couple things that are interesting about that film to me, which is one, like obviously what I'm talking about, and I wrote about white male millennials because that's who I am. And I think, again, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, who was like, but you don't understand, this is true for, like I'm a Black woman. This is like, we've been like forced to write this like stupid crap too. Like, and I'm like, well, at least you get to get published, but like, but I think it was like a necessary, and that's
a powerful book to understand this topic more deeply is Ronnie Goldman's Conservative Claims of Cultural Oppression. So talks about how the left has monopolized our dominant cultural institutions. They get to define what is prestigious, and they get to exclude those who don't exemplify the woke mind outlook. So there's a monopolization of cultural institutions on the left. Donald Trump is trying to bully American institutions back towards the center. We have a progressive clerisy, right? We have this secular elite in media, academia, government bureaucracy, and NGOs who don't rule via economic power, but they rule by persuading, instructing, regulating, and stigmatizing. So they will portray themselves as not filtering on the basis of anti-white bias or keeping conservatives out, that they claim to just filter for competence. So they will use elite credentials like degrees from Ivy League universities to serve as signals of membership in this elite class, and they effectively bar those who don't possess such credentials. And they redefine merit as this type of secular elite education, right, to favor their own brand of cultural capital, right? And so being thoughtful and educated is used to describe those who have the type of elite education that is valued. And there will be all sorts of upper middle class syntax, a vocabulary, a woke language that shows you're a good person. And those who don't master this syntax, like Sarah Palin, are just dismissed as stupid. Now, every dominant in-group identity tends to pathologize and justify why excluded groups deserve to be excluded. So Thomas Sowell wrote about this in The Vision of the Anointed. Right? Elites view themselves as morally and intellectually superior. Dissenters are not just wrong, they are sinful and mean-spirited. Now, dominant elites dismiss conservative views as unworthy of debate. These are symptoms to be diagnosed. These are diseases to be cured. This is a conservaphobia that allows elites to bypass debate and simply exclude conservatives from the sphere of rational discourse. And all sorts of conservative values like gun ownership or religious tradition are portrayed as barbaric and atavistic, and thus it's justified to exclude conservatives from the civilized order. Now, how do conservatives fight back? Right? They sign on to a populist agenda. They make whatever alliances they need to make to take power. The state is a coercive apparatus, right? The state employs police and the IRS and all sorts of tools to keep people in line. And it's foolhardy to be indifferent to who controls this coercive apparatus. So conservatives have formed a distant culture and a counterculture with talk radio and homeschooling to resist the hegemony of the liberal status system. And you have a critical theory of the right that is unearthing the subterranean structures of liberal discourse to show that liberal claims of merit and neutrality are really just masks for a subjective, partisan, left-leaning political agenda. So you have a knowledge elite in our dominant institutions using their power and their control over language, credentials, and norms to actively exclude conservatives from social prestige and professional power. And conservatives are excluded often on the basis of cultural fit. So while it's illegal to usually racially discriminate, you can keep people out if you don't like their politics, if you don't like their clothing, if you don't like how they smell. And you can frame this as just upholding professional standards or merit, right? You're just defining a cultural fit, a specific vocabulary, a specific secular worldview, a university degree. This is defined as competence. And thus you can exclude those who lack these traits. And you can present your decision as a neutral, objective decision about quality.
Sense like to sort of, say like there are stories and there are stories, and we don't need these tales of woe that, are completely manufactured. I do think what's also interesting about it is the movie itself is the thing that it's critiquing, in that there's like a rapturous audience of like largely like white people who want to be scolded like this, like even within a film about the scolding of the people.
So the number one tool to discriminate against conservatives on the basis of cultural fit is any hesitancy about gay marriage, right? In our elite institutions, that automatically marks you as a bad person. And you're a bad cultural fit for this elite institution. It's probably the number one tool for elite state disclosure. Any hesitancy about same-sex marriage, right? Support for same-sex marriage has become a near unanimous norm in elite circles of academia, media, tech, finance by the 2015 Obergefell decision. Any dissent or hesitancy on this and related social questions shows that you're a bad fit for elite institutions. So when elites use these vague cultural fit criteria, right, the shared worldview, vocabulary, right, they defend this as merit or just professional standards. Now, when non-elites exclude based on their traditional values, that is labeled bigotry and faces all sorts of legal and social backlash. So we have an asymmetry because our dominant cultural institutions define what counts as merit and what counts as bigoted discrimination. So people on the left see this as protecting against harmful bias.
But yeah, I think this is, to get to the larger question of art, I think like this has been a problem for everyone, not just white men. White men happen to, not publish as much because of it, but I think it's made a lot of other books much worse than they might have been.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose part of it is also I suppose maybe part of what's part of the reaction to the piece is that people are sort of primed to think about things in terms of narratives of victimhood and who the victims are.
So in the 1960s, right, it became increasingly prestigious to claim victimhood status. Prior to the 1960s, it was low status to claim victimhood. Now, an interviewer for some kind of elite institution can legally refuse to hire someone if they simply don't like the person for being a Republican or a gun owner or an adulterer or hating the Chicago Cubs, right? These are all acceptable personal cultural preferences. But there is one unforgivable sin, right? If you reject an applicant because of their homosexuality, then you're violating the norms of the elites, right? If an applicant shows any hesitancy about gay marriage, right, this isn't just a difference of opinion, right? This is the type of bigotry that must be stamped out and discriminated against. So we've had this profound linguistic and legal shift from moral disapproval to animus. Elite culture refuses to accept any hesitancy to gay marriage as a legitimate moral or religious position. Just shows that you are animated by bigotry. You're a bad person. You're driven by spite and by hatred and by some kind of mental defect. And you have all these elite institutions that claim to value openness, but it's an openness that is completely closed to the traditional perspective on life. So elites are privileged to have their prejudices against traditionalists, and these are described as professional standards. Conservatives and their prejudices, they get criminalized and socially punished. So the dominant conservative position on trans is that it is exhibition of mental illness, and that for many years would get you banned from social media, right? Get you banned from polite society. So the old forms of status closure were often based on race, religion, and lineage. The new MAHA's closure is increasingly based on ideological conformity and your educational credentials. So certain perspectives on life, the religious and traditional and nationalist and tribal perspective, is described as low status and morally disqualifying. So this way, liberal elites can filter out those from different cultural and religious backgrounds without explicitly citing those backgrounds. Right? Taste is a marker of class. So in the West, moral values have largely replaced aesthetic taste as the primary signal of elite status. Right? Support for gay marriage is a consensus view among elites, and it functions as a highly efficient friend-enemy distinction. If you support gay marriage, it shows that you're part of the cosmopolitan, secular, and progressive managerial class. And it happened so rapidly, within about 20 years.
Of a given situation. And so, on one hand, I think, part of what makes your framing provocative is that it is willing to at least initially present it that way. But I think, ultimately that's not, as I understood it, really your point. And so those who kind of read it that way kind of missed what you were really getting at. But nonetheless, I mean, I think this, maybe the broader thing is this demand for narratives of victimhood, which has kind of produced a lot of the pathologies that, that film is making fun of. But, on the right, you do have I'm trying to think, there's a book by a conservative commentator named, I think, Jeremy Carl, that's called Unprotected Class or something. And it's about, how white men are the actual victims of American society or something like this. So you see this
like a sort of white identitarian fiction. And it's no, the thing that will solve it, the point of fiction, and there's that great Zadie Smith essay, but is to sort of inhabit other worlds, other than your own.
So when people encounter status closure, when people suddenly realize that the game is rigged against them, they do not tend to react moderately, right? There tends to be a fury. And
I think part of what's happened over the last decade is that possibility has been specifically foreclosed to younger white men, and has made their novels worse for it. But you're not going to. The other thing I saw a little critique, from the right, which is who cares about the New Yorker? Who cares about just no one cares about reading. Just publish. Write what you're going to write on your write it on Substack. Self-publish it on Amazon. And it's do you really want to give up on the idea of any shared culture?
So when you fail to connect and fail to join and fail to bond with others, when you suffer these kind of failures, you lose energy, you lose strength, and you will naturally tend to withdraw. The more you withdraw and the less energy and strength you have, the less likely you are to be excellent and to achieve. So people enter positive or negative feedback loops, right? You get on the same page and you create camaraderie with other people, and you will gain in strength and energy, and more good things are likely to happen. You start this losing loop of withdrawal and resentment, and skipping mixers and holiday parties and opportunities to connect with others, right, you will start to spiral down. So all sorts of people hit these hidden forms of state disclosure, don't understand what's happening, and withdraw more and more from life, become more and more resentful, isolated, bewildered, confused. You have to have an optimism usually to keep extending yourself into the world, right? Often an undue optimism is a more useful way to go about life because it gives you strength and energy. Without strength and energy, it's hard to be excellent.
Sure, that anyone has. Do you really want, what? No writer in the last 200 years has dreamed of having a readership of 500 people who don't, who are all like, it's just, you want a culture that, like moves together in some way. And I think, to silo everyone is a mistake. And I don't think the cure for this is some sort of like, well, now we're just going to publish like tales of like white men being sad, or angry.
So many Christians, many traditionalists feel like their very identity has been criminalized. And so they just drop out of many of our elite institutions. So this status closure by elites, this lock that keeps those without woke views out, right? Then along comes Donald Trump, right? And he is the battering ram to smash the door down, right? Populism in general, the MAGA movement in particular, are types of counter-revolution by those who've been closed out by these forms of state disclosure, these linguistic codes, credentials, and moral litmus tests, right? So we have a more wide-open Overton window these days since the re-election of Donald Trump. We have a rejection of linguistic closure and HR speak. Many people felt they were losing in life, not because they were incompetent, but because they couldn't engage in the therapeutic language of the coastal elite, right? Or the I statements and holding space and inclusivity, right? Trump is the anti-HR candidate. He speaks in hyperbole, insults, direct confrontation. He is the opposite of the polished, distinct university voice required for elite status. So when Trump violates norms of civility, his supporters do not see a bad man, right? They see someone refusing to play a rigged game. So when Trump is attacked for being rude and non-presidential, it signals to his supporters he creates the same discomfort in elites that I do. Right? Millions of Americans feel that expertise has become a tool of exclusion rather than a measure of excellence. So when Trump attacks the deep state and the intelligence agencies and the public health experts and the credentialed class, right, he devalues the currency that the elites hoard. Right? If the experts are idiots, as Trump often claims, then the PhDs and the Ivy League degrees that justify their power are worthless. So this is a massive status reversal that feels like justice to Trump supporters, to those without credentials.
You want a bigger thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I was wondering whether the current moment, and so it seems like, part of what you're getting at towards the end is that the situation of the writer, of the profile you're focused on is itself a sort of interesting
world white male millennials have faced in the last decade. They should be able to sort of say, like, Ben Lerners of the world, like, screw off, like, we have something more authentic and real to offer. But they haven't. So that's sort of the crux, I guess.
I'm glad you brought up Topeka School. I found that book very annoying. Which became incredibly sort of pious and self-serious.
Like, there are good guys and bad guys, and the bad guy from 1996 is wearing a red baseball hat, and I'm at an ICE protest. So, it's just so risible in its conclusions that it sort of poisoned the rest of the book for me, which I think I liked as I was reading it. I don't quite, remember, but the end of it just completely destroyed any like residual goodwill I had for it.
Agreed. Yeah, I felt similarly, and I do also remember enjoying and certainly like giving it the benefit of the doubt for most. And he says at some point he says like his father was a fascist or something like that, and so and there's kind of this idea that he's like trying to play into this, I don't know, sort of Spanish like lefty students' ideas about like middle American fathers being these kind of authoritarian monsters. And
I think this is part of what the collapse of the distinction between like author and character is, the need for the author to be like a good person, or the book to reflect well.
A defining moment in American political life in 2016 of moral status closure was Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment, right, which explicitly said that about half the country is racist, sexist, and homophobic, right, the Trump half. And Trump accepts these bad people. You don't have to morally repent to join his coalition, right? He offers a big tent for the morally stigmatized. He says, they think you're a bad person because you own a gun, you drive a truck, you go to a church, right? I think you're a patriot. So Trump neutralizes the shame weapon that elites have been using to enforce social status closure. Donald Trump is a traitor to his class. He's a billionaire who rejects billionaire tastes. So the cultural elite mock Donald Trump for his gold toilets, his steak with ketchup, his tie length. But the working class can identify with him. Trump is the great parole whisperer. The working class sees Trump as a class traitor, uses his resources to attack the people who usually attend the galas. So the elite institutions tell trad Christians and trad nationalists, you're losers, you don't go to the right school, you don't use the right words, you have the wrong values. Trump's political success, winning in 2016, again in 2024, breaks the loop. It shows that you can violate all the rules of status closure, you can be rude, you can ignore the experts, you can mock the expert moral consensus, and you can still win. So this turns loser psychology into winner psychology, right? It validates the idea that the elite gatekeepers are not all-powerful gods, they are vulnerable obstacles that can be defeated. So support for Trump is less about policy details, right? More about status warfare. Support for Trump has become a defensive alliance of everyone who's been filtered out by the airport test.
On the author as a human and not, here are some characters and some of them are terrible and I can get into the mind of a terrible person and portray them sympathetically. And I think, so I think that's like happened clearly for like a whole lot of authors where there's just no ability to separate yourself from your work. And, no one wants to just read books about like people who mean well, like, I don't know. And
so status anxiety, right, drives a lot of political actions. And people who feel like America's leading institutions are aligned against them, these are people who vote for Donald Trump, right? It's this threat to their status that is felt more keenly than economic hardship, right? So people who are bewildered by all these invisible barriers like cliques and stereotypes and linguistic shibboleths, right? People who have internalized failure, they can then externalize blame onto the system, and Trump's grievance-based rhetoric appeals to them. Also, long-term economic stagnation where people just consistently lose in the ability to provide for their families due to the globalization of America's economy, to outsourcing, to reducing trade barriers with the outside world, which has destroyed America's manufacturing base. So fewer and fewer people with, say, IQs under 100 are able to find employment that is sufficient so that they can have a family and support themselves. So this cultural backlash against status threats from diversity hires and from elite woke moral standards drives resentment against America's institutions and elites and drives support for populism, drives support for people like Donald Trump. In the summer of 1988, when I was a few months into chronic fatigue syndrome, I was lying around a lot reading books like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And there are certain passages in that book I've never forgotten. One of them was in Book 1, Chapter 10. And Smith wrote, people of the same trade seldom gather together, even for merriment and diversion. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So Adam Smith isn't saying that business people are evil, saying that their incentives are not aligned with the public interest. Right? The public has an interest in low prices, high quantity, competition. The profession's interest, high prices, limited supply, restricted entry. And so you have the development by free market economists of public choice theory. And they see, in particular, professions as conspiracies. You have occupational licensing as a cartel. When you have all these increased requirements to be a hair braider or a florist or interior designer, right, you see a conspiracy against the public. Now, the official logic is we need to license florists to protect the public safety. The Economist says existing florists lobbied for this law to make it illegal for anyone else to compete with them lest they pay expensive fees and spend years in training. So professions and these groups spend money lobbying the government to grant them special privileges like monopolies and subsidies. And these professional associations appear to economists as rent-seeking organizations, right? They limit the supply of new professionals to keep wages for current members high. And George Bernard Shaw, in his play The Doctor's Dilemma in 1986, he put, all professions are conspiracies against the laity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was curious how you see the
appropriation discourse of the 2010s. So, like, if you can't appropriate someone else's story, like the only story left is your own or some lightly fictionalized version of your own. And there was a paragraph that I deleted from the piece, but it was about, Dean Kissick's article in Harper's. And there was a quote that he had that I think really sort of summed it up, which is, quote, if an artwork's effective power derives from the artist's biography rather than the work, then self-expression is redundant. And I think that means, like, in the art world, and also I think in literature, I think they're closely related in terms of the cultural shifts. White men's biographies are, irrelevant in terms of but that has become the primary relevant thing to marketing a piece of art. So you're left, you end up writing like small autofiction, which, if you're a genius can be.
So when people realize that the meritocratic door is closed to them and they talk to other people who have the same experience, they eventually stop knocking and they go find a battering ram, which is the populist movement instead. So you can understand the rise of populism as the losers pushing back. So the current populist coalition in MAGA wheels together two distinct groups of losers who usually don't talk to each other. You have the economic losers, the masses, and you have the status losers, the counter-elite, right? Jacob Savage's lost generation, the canceled academics, the blocked writers, the maniacs in the group chats, the highly educated, the very smart, feel they've been denied the status that they deserve. So they provide the strategy and the ideology for the populist movement. You have a counter-elite that provides the language to weaponize the anger of the masses. Right? They explain why the factory closed, globalism, why the culture feels hostile, the Overton window. And they push back. They say, burn the credentials. Losers realize they cannot win the game of credentials. The incumbents control universities and HR departments, so the strategy is to devalue the currency of the elite. When you're winning in a status game, you don't want to admit it's a status game. It's just a pursuit of something good. When you're losing in a status game, you mock and call out the status game, right? If you can't get a PhD from Harvard, you can convince half the country that Harvard is woke madrasa and that its degrees are worthless, right? You can mount an explicit attack on the asset value of the elite. So populism asserts that vitality will win out over propriety, that the toxic, rude, maniacal energy that the elite purged can be reformed, reassembled to batter down the doors that discriminate against traditional Americans. So now Trump is in power. He's using the power of the state to try to defund and investigate the switchboard institutions, the NGOs and the universities that enforce status closure. Now, populists usually don't do very well at governing because they're not normally dominated by high human capital. So I had a big concern about this Trump administration, whether it would lack competence, right? The dog catching the car, populists have stormed the cockpit, they've thrown out the pilots, the deep state, the technocrats, but do they know how to fly the plane? So if the economy crashes, if the power grid fails, if logistics crumble due to the anti-expert purges of the populace, right, the public will beg the old elite to return. Resentment can't pave roads, right? If the incumbents possess the technical locks, the banking rails, the internet infrastructure, the intelligence agencies, and the new populists can't run institutions as well, then the elite will storm back. So when the elite ran things, they were able to debank populists. They were able to algorithmically throttle populist communication. They used lawfare to bankrupt the counter-elite. They were able to seemingly suffocate in the crib their biggest enemies. Now they're back. So this lost generation, the people like Jacob Savage don't want to destroy Harvard. They want to teach at Harvard. They want to bully American institutions back towards the center. Now, it's possible that Trump pulls this off. It's possible that the populists win. It's possible that we will get a new elite. It's possible that legacy institutions that defy Trump will suffer a solvency crisis. They might go bankrupt because nobody trusts them anymore. And perhaps parallel institutions will become the new mainstream because they might survive while the old ones rot from their own lack of funding and vitality. You may see more and more elites defect to the populist side. Trump has considerable support in Silicon Valley. You have a counter-elite that is receiving funding and demonstrating competence that the masses lack. So they are mounting currently under Trump a hostile takeover of the state. So if populists keep winning elections and start using 1964 civil rights legal machinery against its creators, right? If they use disparate impact laws to sue universities for discriminating against white men and conservatives, they purge the bureaucracy using Schedule F, they use the state to break the status closure of private institutions, then you might get populism proving its competence and providing a market correction for a status market that has been manipulated against the public interest for too long. Now, if populism fails, the West likely moves back towards a soft totalitarianism where the elite maintain control through high-tech surveillance and censorship, the iron cage. We might enter a chaotic period of circulation of elites where the lost generation gets a turn to rule, begins building its own mechanism of status closure to keep the next generation out.
Be good, but I don't know. It just sort of feels like a small way of doing literature. Like we don't have like too many Prousts these days.
So you bring up briefly the figure of delicious tacos and these kind of I suppose this realm of sort of I don't know dissident literature, which often is written by people of this demographic profile who in many cases probably legitimately experience some sense of being squeezed out or not having opportunities within the literary world. And so I'm curious what you make of that. A
few delicious taco stories I absolutely love, and some of it can be great, but it's just as small as it's like, not to keep hard.
Probably the greatest decoder of the elites and of the status games that the elites play is Tom Wolfe. Another great decoder of status games is David Pinsoff. He's a professor of evolutionary psychology at UCLA. Writes a great Substack called Everything is Bullshit. He blends evolutionary psychology, signaling theory to examine status games. So he can look at the status closure described by Jacob Savage not as a tragedy, not as a moral reckoning, but as a raw biological power struggle disguised as morality. So David Pinsoff's core thesis is most human behavior, especially in the realms of politics and morality, is BS. These are just narratives we invent to conceal our self-interested pursuit of status, resources, and mates. So ideology is a costly signal. The invisible curriculum that Jacob Savage describes is a costly signal. So if entering the elite was easy, anyone could do it. To create a high-status club, you need an entry fee. In the past, this might have been mastering Latin or wearing a corset. Today, the fee is adopting a specific set of woke beliefs that are psychologically difficult for the standard white male to hold. Right? I must apologize for my very existence. And humiliation is the point. So if Ben Shattuck or other submissive writers described by Jacob Savage willing to publicly debase themselves to please their editors, they've proven their loyalty to their regime. They signal, I value membership in this coalition more than I value my own dignity. That makes them safe insiders. So if you strip away the language of equity and fairness, you can view this as coalitional aggression. The state is a coercive mechanism. Why would you not want this coercive mechanism on your side? So in America, you have two dominant coalitions, the coalition of the center of those informed by Christianity and Europe. Then you have a coalition of the fringe. right? Women, minorities, gays, people who feel excluded by dominant white male Christian society. So status closure is really just a polite term for dominance behavior. So if you can label the traits of the rival coalition, ambition, stoicism, military history as toxic or problematic, then the dominant woke coalition can demonetize the assets of their rivals. Right? It's the intellectual equivalent of sorting the earth so that the enemy cannot grow crops. Right? And then you can engage in moral grandstanding and just stomp your opposition into humiliation. Then you can also engage in the sneaky fucker strategy, right, where beta males cannot compete with alpha male through dominance, so they often adopt sneaky strategies. They appear hyper-submissive to gain access to resources. So many of the writers that Jacob Savage describes, right, practice self-domestication, right? They realize they cannot win the status game through traditional masculine competence, which is now penalized by the elite, so they try to win through moral submissiveness. They try to signal that they are safe, that they are tame, hopes that the dominant coalition will toss them some status, such as a book deal or a fellowship. And to do this, they have to produce writing that is dull and humorless, because domestication breeds safety, doesn't breed vitality or excellence.
Harping on this, but like, you know, the idea of literature is like inhabit like a different world, and it just feels as solipsistic as the opposite for the most part. That and the other part of it is look, I think that if there was like some dissident writer was like a true genius and had written, you know, like a David Foster Wallace level book, this would be a different discussion. But I think that they haven't yet. Maybe there's one coming.
But Jacob Savage is so dangerous because he says the quiet part out loud, right? He shows that the narratives around diversity, historical trauma, and equity are BS. These are just cover stories used to justify a transfer of resources. Right? Reality is often a zero-sum war for positions at our elite institutions, from the New York Times to Harvard. So the lost generation didn't lose out because they were morally deficient. They lost because they were outcompeted in a new game of signaling. They were bringing a resume to a beauty contest. Then they became confused why the judges who are looking for moral signaling keep giving them zeros. The most thoughtful reactions to the Jacob Savage piece are on Substack. So we have Genevieve Mango writes, "What is most urgently needed now is a larger cultural renaissance in which the extraordinary achievements of white men will be recognized and honored, including by the women who have so often been the beneficiaries of their hard work, their ingenuity, intellectual curiosity, individual enterprise, collaborative genius, humanity, and self-sacrificing generosity. This is a signal opportunity for white men to become aware of their identity as white men, despite the predictable arguments that will be launched against that. We cannot rely on those who hate white men, make a living slandering white men, to correct the injustices white men are now suffering."
So it just feels like a sort of rebellion for its own sake, which like is respectable, but I don't. Again, you know, what you want is some common literary culture, and I think that you know is not that. If that makes sense.
All right, here's another conversation from Compact Magazine, came out December 18th.
Savage's essay, The Lost Generation. Fair to say it's been a sensation. More than 10 million views on Twitter. You know, one of our tweets promoting it. The chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, drew attention to the issues raised in the essay, as did the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. Elon Musk, that sage, also weighed in. Quite a response to the piece. Jeff, let me center your voice here.
It's interesting. Obviously, it wasn't entirely unexpected, because Jacob's previous piece for us, The Vanishing White Male Writer, was also a bombshell. And so, it's clearly tapping into something, and not just the topic, but the particular way that he approaches it. I think not as somebody who's particularly, certainly not as a kind of conservative ideologue or a kind of crusader against affirmative action or something like that. he clearly comes at it fundamentally out of his own experience. And
so Fox News did a segment, Who are the Lost Generation? Features an interview with Jacob Savage.
Welcome back. There's a powerful new article. It's gone viral. The Lost Generation. It's about young white men failing to rise professionally. Now, Jacob Savage describes in the article how he had a career dead end before his film career in writing ever really took off. He wrote, "This was it. The moment of our careers were supposed to take off, we'd put in our time. I'd been tutoring SATs and reselling tickets to make ends meet while I wrote. And while 5 years seemed par for the course based on slightly older guys we knew who had already made it, it wasn't by 2016. We were already too late." The showrunner, the employer for writers in Hollywood, emailed us back and apologetically said, "I hadn't initially thought I might be able to bring you guys in, but in the end, it turns out this is not possible." They went ahead and met with the executive anyway, a Gen X white guy, who told us how much he loved our pilot, but the writer's room was small. He explained apologetically, and the higher-level writers were already all white men, and they couldn't have an all-white male room. Maybe if another show got a season, they'd bring us on. They never did. And Savage is right. Over time, you began to see these policies take shape in industry across industry in this nation. It reached a fever pitch, of course, although it didn't begin. It reached its peak during the riots of George Floyd. That's when Democrats literally took a knee. White men were the problem, then and now.
Our country should be more fearful of white men across our country, because they are actually causing most of the deaths within this country.
White men, something is broken. Something is cracked deep inside when so many of you believe the answer to fear, to loss, to change is violence.
Now an entire generation of young men are and have been paying the price. The author of that piece, Jacob Savage, joins me now. Jacob, thanks for being with us here today. Your article is everywhere. Everybody's reading it and sharing it. And it's built upon two fascinating things. One, your personal experience and the personal experience of others that you know across industries, academia, journalism, writing, television, and the stats, Jacob. You give us a lot of stats, not just the anecdotes of what have happened in all these industries. Yours, writing, is a great example. In 2011, 48% of jobs at the lower level were white men. By 2024, under 12%. So what do you think about this? Something that you say started in 2014.
I think we sort of just started noticing things change. I would say sort of about our cohort is we grew up in the 90s on race-blind, gender-blind idea of meritocracy, which is not to say that it was always perfect, but we thought when we graduated from college that generally the best person would get the job. And then very suddenly those rules shifted on us, and it became much more based upon identity in all these different fields. And I think sort of that gap between what our expectations were and what ended up happening fueled a lot of pretty weird stuff, honestly.
Well, and it made it almost impossible statistically for you to advance and for your friends to advance. In some cases, even get the first job. I'm curious, and I think in the piece you describe yourself as or at least a lot of the people you describe as men of the left. So I'm curious how everyone feels today. I mean, to be openly discriminated against, proudly discriminated against, that's a pretty radicalizing experience.
Yeah, I think people have a sense that, even if they were or still are men of the left, there's less of a sort of hardcore belief, especially among white men of my cohort. They feel something much deeper has changed that is fundamentally illiberal, and having been subject to what happened, aren't as enthusiastic maybe as they once were.
I've read your piece, and I've seen a lot of the conversation around your piece. There is a guy who has been on this show, a guy named Jeremy Carl, and he appreciated your piece, but he had some criticism for you, and I just want to see your response to that. He said, it's a little bit like the story, while he lauded your piece, it's a little bit like the story of the frog who gives a ride to a scorpion across the river. Like, you flirted with this. If you're of the left, you flirted with this movement, with this identity, and now it's stung you. Could you not see this coming? What's your response?
My response is that I don't think anyone, I don't think this is sort of based upon someone being of the left or the right. This happened in all these prestige industries, regardless of one's personal politics. I think it also happened, quite frankly, in other industries. These were just the industries that relentlessly cataloged it for everyone to see and made the statistical stuff much easier to find. I think in terms of whether or not people deserve to get what they got is almost beside the point at this point. I think going forward, ideally what we would all want is just a fair system for everyone in this country.
So many thoughtful essays about Jacob Savage's work on Substack. A blog by John Carter, named John Carter, writes that the young men who lose out in this purge didn't think of themselves as aristocrats with a blood right to a certain position in life. They thought they were contestants in a fair competition where they would rise or fall on their own merits and by their own efforts. Then they abruptly find themselves competing in a system where the game is rigged against them, where it's impossible for them to rise, and it's lying to them about the impossible racial barrier that is placed in their way. Right? And if you noticed what was happening, if you noticed the overt anti-white racial discrimination, you were told you made it up. This was ridiculous. That as a white man, you're automatically and just massively privileged, that it was impossible to discriminate against you. You can't be racist against white people, and you must be a bigoted racist. You must be clearly mediocre. You must be a bitter little man clinging to your guns and religion. You must be filled with envy for the winners in life, for the brilliant, beautiful black women who outcompeted you just because they were so much smarter, so much more dedicated, so much better than you. Because they succeeded despite the deck being stacked against them. You failed despite being born with every unearned advantage in the world. So an entire generation of young white men had their future ripped from their hands, then told it was their own fault. Right? They were gaslit. They were lied to. They were told there's no systemic racial discrimination against you. Your failure to launch is purely due to your failings. Right? Incredibly cruel and sadistic. Right, young white men internalized that they were to blame for their own failures, and if they'd received dollops of secular education, they'd been raised to be good liberals, good egalitarians, good anti-racists, good feminists. And to recognize that you are being racially discriminated against, well, to say that out loud was to throw your lot in with the bad people, the hate-filled reactionary people, the MAGA crowd. Right, the only socially acceptable way to talk about whites and men, right, is to do it in a wrinkle your nose in disgust fashion when you say those cursed and filthy words. And complaining about this overt racial discrimination, it made you a bad person, made you look weak, made you look like you're a whiner. You were filled with sour grapes. You're a poor sport. No one likes a sore loser. The world doesn't owe you anything. Stop being so privileged, so entitled. You didn't build it. Right? Someone else's turn now. Take your setbacks with a shrug and a stoic grin. Try harder next time. And then they did try harder the next time, and they kept failing. They redoubled their efforts, doubled them again. Nothing could break through an overt anti-white, anti-male wall. Then occasionally they'd compare notes with other young white men who mutter that they were having the same experience. And this torture went on for a decade. So maybe it's time to push back. Maybe organizations, whether universities, corporations, neighborhood associations, churches, civil society groups, volunteer organizations, maybe they should pay a penalty for their overt anti-white, anti-male discrimination. Maybe this would rapidly reestablish meritocracy where it matters, right? Maybe those employers who discriminated against the highest performing groups will become outcompeted by those who do not. We have had this phenomenon of deaths of despair. This is primarily occurring in America in young white men who increasingly seem like American Indians trapped on reservations after the buffalo herds have been slaughtered. They've been left with nothing but time and firewater on their hands. Right? The American Indians' traditional way of life was hunting, fishing, gathering, farming, right? You needed land to do this. That land was taken away. Over the past 50 years, the traditional mode of life for white men, right, such as employment with a large corporation or as a blue-collar factory worker or white-collar symbol manipulator, right, these institutions start systemically racially discriminating. And white men were pushed out.
It has a sort of authenticity that's, I think, grounded in his own trying to kind of make sense of his own experience and that of other peers. And so, I think that's why it's sort of able to speak more broadly in a way that's something that's more kind of polemical and politically, targeted at, pushing a particular line might not. I do think, I would say, just speaking for myself as somebody who, is sort of part of the cohort that he describes, clearly there are ways that it's unpleasant and uncomfortable to kind of think about oneself in these terms. And yet, at the same time, throughout the 2010s, you were kind of told that you had to. And so there was kind of that weird disjunction where you were kind of repeatedly told, no, you are this thing. And, the dominant tenor of the public discourse became, this is like the bad group of people who we can safely sort of crap on and say bad things about as a group.
So the Overton window refers to those topics you're allowed to publicly talk about. So think of state disclosure as the lock on the door, and the Overton window is the house rule determining who gets a key to the locked door. So we have an increasingly purified elite that is increasingly disconnected from the population it rules. And the window is a filtering mechanism. State disclosure requires something to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys from the insiders from the outsiders. So explicit anti-white discrimination is illegal or taboo. So the narrowing of the Overton window becomes a new implicit tool for filtering. So by narrowing the range of acceptable opinions, institutions create a high-friction filter. And to enter the elite, to get a PhD, a book deal, the tenure track, right, you must demonstrate total fluency in the specific, narrow, ideological language of the elite. Much of education is an education in submitting and complying. Right? And so this invisible curriculum where a student knows not to study military history because it is white and dead. This is the Overton window. It acts as a status filter. And the window gets narrowed to exclude military history and closes the status hierarchy to anyone with interests that go against the elite consensus. So if you can narrow the Overton window, right, you can more effectively filter people out. Right? You don't fire the old guard for being old. You fire them for holding opinions that were standard in 2010 but became problematic in 2014. So the last generation experienced the Overton window narrowing around them, and to survive, they had to constantly update their software. They had to apologize for being white to try to stay inside the shrinking window. Those who don't do this, who don't humiliate themselves, get purged. So state disclosure ensures that only people within the narrow Overton window get access to power and resources. Once they are in power, they have to keep narrowing the Overton window further because they have no internal interaction with opposing views. So you'll get academic departments composed entirely of people who agree that military history is problematic. And they will start to view even a mild interest in military history as some kind of radical, fireable offense. So you have an anti-excellence stagnation that has reduced the quality of our dominant institutions. Right? When the Overton window becomes too narrow, when now it becomes suffocatingly tight and dull because writers are terrified of accidentally stepping onto the third rail, they can't effectively explore the human condition. They can only perform safety. So strict state disclosure and a narrow Overton window makes the elite more fragile. By filtering out everyone who disagrees, the elite loses its sensory organs. They don't understand the country they live in and rule because they've used state disclosure to insulate themselves from the majority population. Right? The Overton window is what they must say to get in. By narrowing the window, you increase the cost of entry. You make state disclosure more effective. You make the resulting elite more homogeneous, more paranoid, less competent. So you have a feedback loop of state disclosure, who gets in, the Overton window, what they're allowed to say, creating something you could call a death spiral or epistemic closure. So for institutions like the New York Times, Harvard, or Hollywood studios, right, they've become less competent. Their long-term stability is being threatened because they have become increasingly decoupled from reality, and their competence has been eroded.
Group. And so obviously, I sort of recognize that, and it's helpful to, have somebody, kind of lay it out empirically, but also narratively. It certainly made me, to be honest, kind of living through the 2010s, it wasn't necessarily a way that I, chose to or wanted to kind of narrate my own experience. But in retrospect, it certainly, has some illuminate, whatever. His father was a doctor. His
Talking here about Jacob Savage.
Family went to state schools. So not particularly prestigious, but, very solidly middle class. And, then he sort of managed to get into the Ivy League, and then, had a very sort of charmed career as a, boomer, tenured.
So the white men who move ahead in our elite institutions have overwhelmingly done it by performing rituals of self-abnegation, right? So our institutions have become filled up with conformists. You have our institutions filled with people terrified to step outside the narrow window to produce art that is anything other than dull, humorless, and performative, right? So institutions have become boring. They've lost their vitality because they have exiled the friction and conflict that generates great art and new ideas. As institutions become more homogenous, they lose their ability to speak the language of the general population. The subculture language of the elites, the snapping fingers, the specific DEI jargon becomes the only allowed language. Right? This creates the trust thermocline, where you have one temperature publicly, but then you go down a few feet and the temperature changes rapidly. The general public who don't speak this elite woke language distrust institutions. Initially, they trusted them based on brand loyalty, but as the institutions moved in an increasingly woke agenda, the gap between the institution and the public widened, and then the public trust collapses all at once. Institutions are then forced to rely entirely on a shrinking base of super users, super donors, super subscribers who want their woke radical content. Institutions become trapped. They cannot win moderates back without angering their new radical base. They become captured, and state disclosure prioritizes identity and ideology over competence. Right? If you hire screenwriters based on demographics rather than excellence, you can't make profitable movies. Institutions lose their utility. Universities no longer produce useful analysis. Studios don't produce entertaining movies. Our institutions become zombies. They exist on endowment momentum. They're effectively dead.
White male professor. And so obviously, for much of my own, less successful path through academia, I was sort of comparing myself to him and thinking about what was available to him, compared to me. And obviously, it's, I'd say the sort of figures who get the most criticism in Jacob's piece are figures who, occupied those, sort of white male boomers and Gen Xers who kind of occupied those positions with various kinds of diversity and diversification initiatives, and thought that was important and morally valuable. And, but it's interesting to me because he also kind of knew my own path. And I think on some level, he just somehow wouldn't have seen the connection or somehow wouldn't have imperative to diversify, to recruit more diverse faculty. But it was particularly difficult to fulfill because non-white faculty, essentially, because they were in a better position to, be recruited by, for more prestigious positions. So it was kind of a bizarre kind of middle space to be in because you were kind of not at the top of the pecking order. And in some ways that meant that you were actually, that the department was less diverse because the people who were kind of not able to make it through to the really desirable jobs were.
So where does someone like Mike Benz fit in here? And he functions for Republicans as the forensic accountant of the closure mechanism, of the status closure system. So Jacob Savage describes the cultural and psychological experience of being locked out, the vibe in the writer's room, the social pressure to self-censor. Mike Benz analyzes the technical and bureaucratic machinery that installs the locks on the social closure mechanism. So Jacob Savage describes a soft closure, social pressure, invisible curricula, and the fear of being clapped back on in Zoom meetings. Mike Benz argues that the soft closure wasn't enough, that after the populist shocks of 2016 with Brexit and Trump, the elite realized that mere social pressure could not stop the populist revolt. So Mike Benz documents a shift to hard closure, the use of the censorship industrial complex of government agencies working with NGOs and tech platforms to algorithmically throttle, derank, and silence populist opposition. Right? This is status closure operating at the infrastructure level. Right? You don't just feel unwelcome in the status hierarchy, your ability to communicate with others is severed. So Mike Benz argues that U.S. foreign policy and the intelligence establishment, the blob, realized that free speech on the internet was a threat to their ability to conduct operations abroad and to maintain power at home. So Mike Benz is the archetype of the counter-elite, those who are most dangerous to the regime. His high status in terms of his ability and background, he worked at the State Department, he's articulate, he appears competent, but he felt completely excluded from legacy institutions. So instead of writing sad songs about his alienation, he built a parallel institution, the Foundation for Freedom Online, and he wages war on the closure mechanism itself. He's not trying to join the New York Times. He wants to expose how the New York Times coordinates with NGOs and government bureaucracies and places like the Department of Homeland Security to rig the game. So he poses a lethal threat to the dominant status closure because he understands the internal language of the elite, language of democracy promotion, disinformation, then he turns it against them. So his central thesis is that tools developed for counterinsurgency, coin, abroad would then turn inward against domestic populace. Right? The elite declared a portion of their own population, the lost generation, the MAGA base, the basket of deplorables, to be a foreign insurgency. And then you view your own citizens as insurgents who need to be de-radicalized, right? And this is a breaking in the social contract, right? This is why so many people feel like the system is deliberately rigged against them, that it's been weaponized to maintain a monopoly of the woke elite.
We're more likely to end up in that position, if you see what I mean. So that was kind of a significant part of how I spent, much of the 2010s.
Absolutely 100% certain when I finished my PhD that it was going to be impossible to get a job. Like, I was certain of it. And I had a book contract with a good publisher, and I had done really well. My thesis was really successful. I had publications and stuff. So I was in a good position, but I was 100% certain I was not going to get a job. And I had 3 job interviews, and I got all 3 jobs. So and now I'm kind of soul searching. Was I as good as I thought I was? Perhaps I ticked all the boxes. Although, to be fair, like, the one diversity box that I could tick in the UK probably doesn't mean anything to them. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I had such mixed feelings reading this. I have incredible, it's, awful, and everybody knew that this was going on, but to see it all laid out in such detail and backed up with evidence was just utterly shocking. The way that meritocracy was just sort of thrown out the window. However, while I was reading, you did get the sense, like, I, as a mediocre man, simply expected to coast through life, and I was shocked when this was not the case. And he kind of says, even the successful white men I spoke to understood that something had fundamentally changed. They expressed gratitude and relief, a recognition that success was contingent, easily disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. There was so much fragility to things going well in the first place, one tenured professor told me, that it's natural to think a slight perturbation would have meant things went worse. And I was just thinking, this is literally the first time in my life I realized not everybody feels this way. Like, this guy said this like it was worthy of note that I have success and I fear it might be taken away from me at any time. I literally thought everybody felt like that. Surely, like, the fact that he actually thought that that was worth saying was stunning to me. There are people in the world who are successful and just like, yes, this is where I'm meant to be. My life has unfolded exactly as I thought it would. I find that really shocking. I think this is a whole world I didn't know existed.
So when many people suffer trauma early in life, they tend to react by either making themselves smaller or are making themselves bigger. And Mike Benz took his pain and trauma and made himself bigger. Party Bots throws down $10 super chat. Merry Christmas, Uhib. Thanks for the show. Take us out with a proper Christian choir today, please. I may be a convert to Orthodox Judaism, but I appreciate much of Christian art, and many Christian hymns still speak to me, even though I don't share their theology.
Yeah, so the thing is, okay, I've said that. There were points where I was a little shocked at how much he just kind of thought that things were going to go well for him. But we shouldn't be fighting over the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. And like this feeling of like schadenfreude, where you see some of the responses to this, you know, the overwhelming response has been positive. Like, oh, finally someone has said what I've been thinking. But there are people who are like, oh no, wah, wah, white man tears. Now you're feeling the pain we've all felt for all this time. You know, we shouldn't be like squabbling with each other over the crumbs, as I was saying, the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. And like we've all just accepted this situation that you're going to be educated.
So elites can only rule in a pluralistic society. If populists get their way and you have a more united country, then elites don't get to make alignments with various parts of the pluralist society to maintain their power. Right? That's the only way elites can rule, is if they are confronting a divided society, and then they can pick off various factions and make alliances. Right, here is Mike Benz.
Greenberg viewed the young man as a protege. Early on, he invited Epstein to a dinner party and seated him next to his 20-year-old daughter, Lynn, who told us she suspected it was a setup. The two hit it off and started dating. Now, that's an interesting data point. That's a really interesting data point. And this seems very plausible to me. I could very easily say, I don't know if this is true or a limited hangout told to a New York Times reporter, so it would be recorded as the official story. But having worked at, big New York law firms and working with investment bankers pretty closely, I could very easily see a mid-50s investment banker or law firm partner hiring somebody because he thinks, let's give this kid a shot. And he's a charming, good-looking young guy, and I think he'd be great for my daughter. Like, I could very easily see this happening, where daughters, dating the wrong kind of person, in high school, in college, is at 20 years old, is running, on the wrong side of the track, so to speak. And then this good-looking, nice Jewish boy walks into your office saying he wants to be an investment banker. And Ace Greenberg has sort of signaled, hey, I think I like this guy. I think he'd be a good salesman to pitch our products to pitch our investment products to. And I could just very easily see this. I mean, this is Ace Greenberg, the CEO of Bear Stearns personnel departments. Employees had belatedly gotten around to checking Epstein's resume, which stated he had received degrees from 2 California universities. That was a lie. Are you sitting down, the HR official told Tenenbaum? Neither school has heard of him. So it's like Suits. College degree, or he didn't take he never took the LSAT or something, right? Like this young whiz kid. We're gonna take the heat off with a little. He gets this interview opportunity. It's like some random thing where someone recommends him because he seemed bright. So we respect. I thought of 23-year-old Jeffrey Epstein as being a master manipulator of 55-year-old multimillionaire Bear Stearns executives. No, there's actually a much more, what was their phrase? Prosaic explanation. He's screwing the boss's daughter, and he's doing a decent job in year one with clients, so they don't want to make the soon-to-be CEO of the company pissed off by firing him. What will the girlfriend think when she's now suddenly dating an unemployed loser who doesn't even have a college degree? So what will the boss's girlfriend be left with in terms of her boyfriend's financial future when he's fired from the Dalton School, then he's fired from Bear Stearns, and he's got no college degree, no financial future.
So if Jacob Savage describes the tragedy of the lost generation, Mike Benz describes the crime scene, right? He describes the technical locks on the status hierarchy as a sophisticated system designed to bypass the First Amendment and to automate this elite status closure. And he argues that the elites realize that they can only maintain their status by controlling the internet and public online discussion. How do they do this? Right? By the liability laundry, right? By the government censoring content without technically violating the Constitution. The state cannot legally silence a citizen, but it can create a switchboard of government-funded NGOs and university centers like the Stanford Internet Observatory or the Atlantic Council. So you have the Department of Homeland Security or the State Department identifying dangerous narratives such as skepticism about a particular policy. You pass this on to the switchboard, the NGO. The NGO is a private entity. It's not bound by the First Amendment. It then flags the content of the social media platform. Platform then removes the content or de-amplifies it, says it violates their own private terms of service. Right? This is bureaucratic closure. It allows the elites to enforce their status hierarchy, to silence the lost generation, to silence the populace, while maintaining the illusion it's just private companies enforcing the rules. So this is government censorship laundered through a third party to remove legal liability. Then you have abundant pre-bunking, the cognitive vaccine. Instead of reactive traditional censorship, deleting posts after they go viral, you get this proactive psychological inoculation. You flood the zone with a counter-narrative before the opposition narrative takes hold. So intelligence agencies or think tanks anticipate what the populist critique might be. Say the election was rigged or the pipeline was sabotaged. Then they launch a massive information campaign labeling that specific critique disinformation or a Russian talking point in advance. So this is Overton window control. You poison the well in advance. You ensure that when the counter-elite finally speak, that their audience has been vaccinated against listening. And you have terms of service saturation. You move the goalposts. You pressure platforms to make their terms of service so broad and so vague that any effective political speech is banned at will. All right? Malinformation is the key term. Right? Any information that is factually true but might cause harm or mislead. All right, so just like the writers described by Jacob Savage could not get published because they didn't know the secret cultural rules, online users will get banned for violating rules they didn't know. So it ensures that the out-group is always technically in violation, giving the in-group a pretext to deplatform them whenever they become effective. And you have disinformation repurposed from a military term of counterintelligence against foreign spies to a domestic political tool. You label popular speech as disinformation. So you get to move the issue from the sphere of politics, where we vote and discuss and debate, to the sphere of cybersecurity, where we identify and neutralize threats. Right? You don't debate a cybersecurity threat, you delete it. Right? You strip the counter-elite of their rights of speech, you recategorize them as digital combatants or threats to democracy, and you do everything you can to exclude them from the public square. So Jacob Savage's essay describes a cultural lock where you're excluded because you're uncool or toxic. Mike Benz describes the technical lock where you're excluded because your IP address has been flagged by a DHS-funded algorithm.
Do have a dogma, and that dogma is that human suffering should be combated and human beings should be fine in the earth. And you know, whether or not you believe in a God or no God, or whether you go to church or don't go to church, and all of this sort of conceptualization of religion that Sam Harris has, let's just relieve suffering all over the world, and that will be great. And this place helps you maximize the number of lives you can save. The number of, and here's always the difficult thing with this religion, though, because you can't quite calculate, scientifically distill, as much as Sam Harris would really like to say, yeah, that's easy. Good is lack of suffering, bad is more suffering. You can't really have like these little cubicles, these little quantums of suffering. You can't really have like the quantums of suffering because, of course, you have the problem of first world problems where someone says, my melon is a little bit crunchy. I like my melon perfectly ripe, not mushy, not too crunchy. I like it perfect. And when I bite into a melon that is too mushy or too crunchy, I just suffer. does that qualify for a quantum of suffering? This little suffering calculation thing, so that if we can sort of minimize the amount of suffering on the planet or maximize the amount of happiness on the planet. I mean, that's basically, I've heard Sam Harris run through these arguments time and time again. It's basically where he's going with this. And so Ross Douthat, and this is where I'll say things like, well, if you really want to maximize human pleasure, well, give people cocaine and then have them end their life right after they have cocaine, because they have no more chance to suffer after that. Everyone is maximally happy. And of course, everybody points to Brave New World, where you have Soma, where you can just bliss out. And of course, Ross Douthat is basically saying that we have created a way that we sort of can be short-term happy. It's, our social media, and then AI is just sort of attentional junk food. But maybe AI will be even better than junk food, because maybe AI can relieve suffering, because, to have a therapist sit there and listen to you endlessly about your suffering, if you want to vent about this or vent about that, AI will listen to you vent all you want, and it will be endlessly compassionate and endlessly understanding.
So you've got a feedback loop described in Mike Benz's narrative. You've got the cultural elite that define the correct opinion. Then you have NGOs and universities, the blob, that codify that opinion into disinformation benchmarks. Then they pressure the switchboard, the tech platforms, to enforce those benchmarks via algorithms. So the lost generation finds that not only can they not get a book deal, they can't get hired in the Academy or at the Times or in Hollywood. Now their posts on social media complaining about this are auto-hidden from the public feed. And what got me into thinking about state disclosure was this 1979 book by the sociologist Randall Collins. Once again, it's called The Credential Society, an Historical Sociology of Education and Stratification. So he talks about the elite legal profession organizing itself in the late 19th century on an ethnic basis. So the legal elite were Anglo-Protestant, and they defined the ethnic lawyers as corrupt. So the whole concept of corruption was a definition imposed by the Anglo elite, and the illegal or moral activities protected by the various political machines were the gambling, sports, prostitution, saloons, and riotous entertainment favored by immigrants and the working class. So Randall Collins is one of the elite status closure theorists. So Randall Collins argues that professions like law and medicine organize themselves not just to ensure equality, but to monopolize and dominate the market for their services. And so cultural bias is often disguised as ethics or standards. So the Anglo-Protestant elite defined their own cultural preferences of temperance, order, or formal education as just professional ethics. They then defined the cultural preferences of their rivals, the immigrants and the working class, as corruption. And this is what Jacob Savage describes in his essay, The Lost Generation. The modern elite have defined their own cultural preferences, their DEI statements, their concern with safety, and their therapeutic language as professional standards. They define the preferences of their rivals as toxic, corruption, problematic. Right? Credentials act as currency for purchasing jobs. Right? If you raise the cost of entry, if you force the ethnics to either spend years of money they don't have to get a degree, right, you can keep them at bay. And today's credential inflation, requiring a master's degree for some entry-level job, serves the same purpose, right? It filters out the populist class who cannot afford the time, money for the degree. It filters out those who don't have the psychology to submit to the demands of education. Much of education is just an education in submitting and complying. It filters out those who refuse to submit to the ideological indoctrination of those who do the educating.
And always say the right thing as calculated by what will keep you on the screen. And maybe that's not a perfect measure, but that's probably not a bad measure of engagement, which is exactly what YouTube does. YouTube doesn't really care, for the most part, even though it tries to not be evil, which means that they want to suppress certain kinds of channels and elevate other kinds of channels. But it's just as long as you watch as much YouTube as possible, they are happy. And they basically say, well, as long as you're watching YouTube, you're not, committing crimes or doing anything like this. And so Ross Douthat says, but I'm afraid we are going to debase. Now, Ross Douthat will have an idea about elevated humanity versus debased humanity, and say, I'm afraid we're going to debase humanity with all of these things. And Sam's answer just surprised me.
Your humanity resilient, I think, against these forces.
Yeah, so if you take the job piece, which is really the first point of concern for people, imagine a world where something like UBI was the necessary response to all of the abundance that AI has created. So people don't have to work. Everything has become like chess, which is to say the computers are better at everything, or virtually everything that humans have.
And now this whole scheme of, AI is going to become super abundant, and there's going to be just so much wealth generated that we're going to get this into the hands of other people. And it's like, now, wait a minute. Has a lot of the growth of the American economy or even the world economy sort of made income less variable, or has income inequality grown? Because I'm pretty sure the more money that Google and Apple and Facebook and Microsoft and Tesla, and the more money that all of these corporations have, I really haven't seen, maybe Bill and Melinda Gates, they're gonna do like GiveWell and give stuff to African countries, but I really haven't seen this sort of play out in that the Western nations with more generous social safety nets.
So the Hasidic Jews that I know are largely immune to the problems described by Jacob Savage, because usually they don't invest in secular education, right? They don't expect wider society to be fair, and they're quite happy. In fact, they aim usually to be entrepreneurs, to be men of business, to work for themselves. They're willing to do it in low status and medium prestige jobs. They will run nursing homes. They're just looking to maximize their earnings to support large families. So in this framework of state disclosure, Hasidic community has effectively executed the parallel strategy. So you have a lost generation of white male millennials crashing up against the locked doors of the secular elite, but the Hasidic community never even walked up to the building, right? They are immune to state disclosure because they play a completely different game with different currency. Right? They reject credential currency. They're not trying to buy credentials. Right? They're not spending their prime years acquiring these tickets of MFAs and PhDs only to find that the venue has changed the entry rules with DEI policies. Right? The Hasidim, by and large, are not left hoarding this worthless currency. So the Hasidim usually don't invest in secular education. They refuse to buy the elite's currency, so they don't get robbed by credential inflation. They're not caught by surprise with ideological shifts because they never bought in, right? They hold their wealth in hard assets like real estate and business. They don't try to invest in status assets like degrees and prestige. So strong in-group identity, tribal identity is the ultimate defense against this Overton window policing, right? Those with thin identity, the secular millennials, right, whose identity is defined by their career and their social standing, if they get fired from a magazine or if they get canceled on Twitter, their entire sense of self might collapse. They are fragile. Thick identity, when you're a traditional Orthodox Jew, your identity is defined by the tribe, by the covenant with God, by your community, and by your family and extended family. Right? A Hasidic nursing home operator does not care if the New York Times thinks his views are problematic. Right? His status comes from his standing in the tribe, in the shul, not in the public square. Right? It's much harder to cancel someone who doesn't want your invitation to the party. So the secular elite trade money and time for prestige. Right? The Hasidim trade prestige for money. They're happy to take low-status jobs if it can provide for their families. Right? The secular elite fight over a shrinking number of chairs. They deal with the problems of elite overproduction. The Hasidic community just wants to provide for families. Right? The Hasidic Jews that I know never tried to sign the social contract that the lost generation feels was broken. Right? Jacob Savage's subjects feel like, I followed the rules, I got the good grades, I went to the good schools, I have the right liberal politics, you owe me a seat. The Hasidim didn't expect the world to be fair, they didn't expect society to be fair, they built their own business and their own community. So one group is a disappointed applicant, the lost generation, another group is an independent operator. So the lost generation is vulnerable to the whims of the gatekeeper. The independent operator is not. So it's a tradition among many Hasidic Jews to not study Torah on Christmas Eve. This is Professor Marc Shapiro.
That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing, I just thank you all for coming. Baruch, who I believe is with us, sent me, just to give you an example of what's going on tonight. We have in New Jersey this big indoor amusement park. So they're having a big event tonight, and look what it says. The largest indoor water park in North America, in the American Dream Mall. December 24th, strictly for frum men. You deserve it. It's a holiday weekend, so no work the next day. It's nittel, so no shiur that night. It's Thursday night. That's tonight. We're serving cholent, kishka, and...
So in many Hasidic communities, it is the tradition you engage in recreation on Nitternacht, on Christmas Eve, and you abstain from studying Torah.
Kugel. So there you go. So then some people are there having their cholent and their kishka, because chas v'shalom to learn or even speak about any learning tonight. And we, all of us, 110 of us, we're doing what at least before a couple hundred years, everyone would say was the right thing to do. Okay, the other thing is, I want to tell you is that this goes back, what I'm going to speak to you tonight goes back to an article I wrote in 99. But we're going to see there's a very exciting, some of you might be troubled by what we're going to say. And let me just first say that what I'm looking at tonight is a Jewish folk custom. I certainly don't mean to denigrate any other religion, but historically we can understand that the religions didn't always get along as well as they do today, and Jews were subject to all sorts of persecution, and Jews responded with the pen. And I think we can appreciate this and look at what is a folk custom without, seeing it as an aspect of Jewish cultural history. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you'll see in a minute. If you would go right now to Borough Park or Williamsburg, someone texted, I just saw because it popped up on my screen that where's all social distance. They don't believe in that in Borough Park and Williamsburg. So if you would have gone last night, then the night before, the base medrashes would be full of people learning. And yet if you go tonight, they won't be learning. Because everyone knows in the Hasidic world, tonight is not a night of learning. What do? You can play cards, you can schmooze, you can play chess. You can do anything you want, basically, but you can't learn Torah. Now, what's going on here? How is it that the most important Jewish activity, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, one night a year, not just one night a year, but on the night of the non-Jewish holiday, Jews decide we're not going to learn Torah? This has got to be perhaps the strangest thing that's found in Hasidus, perhaps. And there's a number of things, at least for outsiders, that are strange. This practice has been attacked as foolish, as stupid, as bittul Torah. But as we're going to see, the practice predates the Hasidim. It has nothing to do with them. And in the dispute between the Kol, the Litvaks, and incidentally, those who want to make comments at the end, I'll get to the comments. The Kol, the Litvaks, and the Hasidim about the origin of this practice, you'll see that the Hasidim are actually correct. This custom tonight of not learning is not found in any Talmud.
So the Hasidim generally come from Eastern Europe, and Jews whose descendants come from Western Europe, by and large, tend to respect and like the non-Jews and tend to have fairly moderate political views. Jews in Eastern Europe lived for centuries in an atmosphere of mutual loathing with the non-Jews. So American Jews of Eastern European origins tend to be much more radical Zionist, radical leftist, and to come from a background of mutual loathing with the non-Jews. Jews from Western Europe come from a background of respect for non-Jews.
Or medieval rabbinic literature, it's difficult to see when it first came into existence. That was, I think, the contribution, or one of the contributions in my article. But before even doing that, let me speak a bit about how tonight is termed in rabbinic literature, Christmas Eve, rabbinic literatures. You will not find anywhere in rabbinic literature the word Christmas. Now, that makes sense. Why you wouldn't put it in? It's halachically forbidden to mention the name of an idolatrous holiday. If the holiday includes the idol's divinity. That's what early sources say. So that would suffice for most Jews not to mention Christmas. Yet, interestingly enough, and we spoke about this in the Monday night class, contemporary halachas poskim have ruled that you can say Christmas because it doesn't refer to an idolatry. What it means is Christ's Mass, the Mass of Christ. Now, The fact is, the word Christ doesn't mean idol, it doesn't mean God. It actually means anointed, Mashiach, Christos in Greek. And since other early sources say that you're not supposed to give any adnut, any chashivut, I guess you could say, importance to a Christian religious figure, like an idol, you would think that would be forbidden to call it the Mass of the Messiah or something. But the fact is that it's not. According to the standard poskim, no one seems to have a problem with it. Culturally, Jews don't call it. They come up with all sorts of other names for it, but from a pure technological standpoint, it's not an issue. It certainly is an issue. You shouldn't be referring to Jesus as Christ, because we don't regard him as the Messiah. But although Rav Elio ben Amozik does call him it, strangely enough. Rabbi Yitzhak Ratzhabi, we spoke about him in the Monday night class, and also Rabbi Yehuda Ritzel Henkin, who passed away today. He has a response about how to deal with these matters of Avodah Zarah, and he says there's no problem in referring to the name Christmas, even though if you grew up in a frum world, you never would say Christmas. It's Krasmich or all sorts of other things. Even without a clear halachic prohibition, Jews were accustomed to use derogatory expressions when referring in particular to the Christian religion. This explains why they didn't use the name Jesus. Even today, people, they'll say Yashka, they won't say Jesus. Although, as already it's pointed out by the Ghost Maimonios, there's nothing wrong with saying Jesus. The Vilna Gaon says it. The name appears in the Talmud. The Rambam mentions the name. Chavos Yair in the 16th century already says, though, that the Hamon Am, he refers it to the masses, they regard it as an avon, as a sin, to mention the name of the ones that the Christians were. So, I have someone's is not muted. Okay, so what's the name in rabbinic literature for Christmas? It's called Nittel. It's impossible to know when this name came into being, but we already see it in medieval texts. For some reason, tonight has been referred to in recent.
So the more traditional and intense you go in Christian identity, the more likely you are to hear negative sentiments about other religions, including Judaism and Jews. The more intense you go in Judaism, the more likely you are to hear negative sentiments about other peoples and religions, including Christians. It is just a fact of in-group identity. The more intense it is, right, the more likely people are to have negative feelings about outgroups. Now, with regard to the populist revolt against the dominant elite, who's winning? So with the election of Donald Trump and his eagerness to use state power to try to bully America's institutions back towards the political center, you see populists winning the battle for state power. And you also see at the same time the war of status for cultural power is quite mixed but overwhelmingly aligned against the populists. So Donald Trump is taking a chainsaw to the diversity, equity, and inclusion apparatus. You have the counter-elite successfully seizing the executive branch of American politics. You have the mechanism of hard closure using the state to enforce DEI being dismantled from the top down. You have bureaucrats getting fired and intimidated. Now, in the world of culture, the populists are losing. Right? State disclosure is ultimately about what is considered cool, what is considered moral, and the populist coalition have not replaced the elite cultural values. So the Overton window in prestige culture of publishing Hollywood Ivy League is still firmly controlled by the left-wing elite. The most promising sign for populism is the emergence of a counter-elite, people like Mike Benz, Stephen Miller. So all sorts of people who are previously canceled or excluded now moving into positions of power within the Trump administration. So we're seeing some change in the circulation of elites. The lost generation is finding some vehicles for their ambition, not by joining the New York Times, but by starting their own Substack. So we're currently in a Thermidor moment, right? The Thermidor is the phase of the revolution where the radical energy is being institutionalized. The excesses of the previous regime are getting rolled back. Populists winning the hard power struggles. They're losing the soft power struggles in culture. The ultimate test will be how competent and excellent the insurgents are. If they're unable to provide a high quality of life for Americans, then the old elite will rule and roll back into power.
Decades, I guess, maybe even a century, as Nittelnacht. And yet that's not the authentic term. It's only, if you look in early rabbinic literature, it's only Nittel. They don't call it Nittel Nacht. The Nittel's come to, well, technically you could say it's all of Christmas. It really is referring to tonight, all the practices. But okay, Nittel Nacht as well. Where does this come from? We'll see what the rabbis have to say because they get it all wrong. But it actually, its origin is Natali Dominus, birth of our Lord. That's the same root as the word, for instance, Noel. The rabbinic authors, not knowing this, not knowing it means birth, exercise great ingenuity. It depends how it's written, with a tuf or a tet. If you write it with a tuf, they associate it with the word hung, taloi, nital, because of the idea that Jesus was hung, like he was crucified. Others speak of it with a tet. And believe it or not, you have rabbis, it shows how little they know about Christianity. They say that this is the day that Jesus was killed, like Natal, that he was taken. But if you look in the early sources, with the tuf is much more common. So that's, I'm assuming, is the authentic way. Incidentally, I was told by someone who came from Germany that in Germany, Jesus was called the Toloi. The Tol in German has a Tolle, meaning Toloi, the hung one. And, because he was hanging on the cross, or even if you look at it like a rabbinic interpretation, that the rabbis were involved with this, whatever the case may be, I was told that in Germany they had a joke. What bracha do you make on a Christmas tree? And they said, a bracha levatova. A bracha, by the way, regarding Christmas trees, that if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend, after you're done with this, to fulfill a little bit about Nittel. If you don't want to learn the rest of the night, one of the Jewish comedians, Elon Gold, I think it is, he has a whole thing about why it's good that what would it be if we went Christmas trees? There'd be all the shilas. How tall does it have to be? Where do you all the halachos we have? Does it have to be really a real tree, or can it be part plastic? And is it okay? All the shilas, but okay, we don't have it. Incidentally, all the Christian holidays have these names. Easter, Pascha, is called Ketzach, and they have names for all the Christian holidays. Okay, so what are these practices that we speak about tonight? First of all, let me begin by saying that if you speak to someone, as I did years ago, who studied in Lithuanian yeshivas, this practice was not known.
So usually stand-up comics were secular. Many Jews were in stand-up comedy, but they were very rarely Orthodox Jews. But in the last 15, 20 years, we've had a plethora of Orthodox Jews moving into stand-up comedy.
I actually like Christmas. I love the music, the lights, the decorations. I love going to my friend's house. He has a beautiful Christmas tree, but I do not have Christmas tree envy. I don't. Who wants to schlep a tree from the woods or even a store and tie it to the roof of your car and bring it into the house with the schmutz? I don't need that. I don't care how beautiful a tree looks. But here's the main reason why I'm so happy that Christmas trees aren't part of our traditions and our holidays. If it were, there would be 1,000 rules and regulations regarding the tree. There would be a tractate of Talmud, Masechet Ha'etz, and it would just be chapters and chapters of rabbis arguing about how you shecht the tree, where to shecht it, when to shecht it, if it has a blemish, can you even shecht it at all? What kind of tree must it be? Well, it cannot bear fruit because that would be destroying future food, but it must emit sap. You have to see a droplet of sap, a kazayit of sap, because to show it's a living tree, you can't cut down a tree that's already dead. You got to kill it yourself in the most humane way possible. Can a goy cut down the tree for you? Is it mavushal, non-mavushal? Big machloket, big disagreement. When you're bringing the tree, thank you, there's more. When you're bringing the tree into the house, do you make the bracha before you enter the doorway? Hillel says once your left foot is inside the foyer, it's too late. Shammai says no, as long as both feet aren't in the house. And they both agree it may be too late to make the bracha on entering, but it's never too late to make the bracha on mounting, when you mount the tree. And when you're standing the tree up, you should have in mind all the fallen trees that were killed to make paper and furniture. And when decorating the tree, and this is crucial, you must string the lights right to left, but light them left to right. And if, God forbid, if one of the bulbs is out, the whole string's no good. Each bulb represents Klal Yisrael. And if one of our lights are out, we're all out. Some say as long as it's dim, if the light bulb is dim. If you read the Rashi, he says the word dim includes a flicker. If it's a flickering, then there's still some life in the light. It's a flicker. And once the tree is lit, you cannot derive any benefit from the light of the tree. If you want to read, you have to put a lamp next to it. If the lamp goes out, throw the book away, run out of the room. Don't derive any benefit from the smell either. Be with your nose closed and breathe through your mouth. And chas v'shalom, should a stem break off, the whole tree is garbage. But you can't just throw it out. You got to chop it down, save it for next year's chach on Sukkot. Thank you so much. Stand with us. I got to go.
So I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, and I heard 20 times as much anti-Catholic rhetoric as anti-Jewish, but sometimes I'd hear critiques of both Catholicism and Judaism as being overly legalistic and preoccupied by minutiae. Then I convert to Judaism, and I look at Christian theological disputes as preoccupation with minutiae. So I thought it was great when I converted to Judaism that Judaism was about 3,000 years old before people started arguing about a creed of what Jews should believe, while in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, Christians were slaughtering each other in their theological disputes. So whatever your religion, if you take it seriously, you're going to think that other religions are satanic.
Well, I shouldn't say it wasn't known. They knew about it, but they didn't follow it. In Lithuania, and this continues to the present day, I mean, for the Chazon Ish, the Stipler, all of them, in Lakewood tonight, if you're not from a Hasidic background, Torah is studied, well, if we weren't in COVID year, studied like it normally is. There were some exceptions. I was told by the late Professor Waxholder from HUC, who in his...
So this video was uploaded December 27, 2020, so during the early first year of COVID. The position of the observer is a key part of the data, and one of the ways that I like to relax before I go to bed is to watch a Dallas Cowboys game that they won back in the 1970s or the 1980s. And currently I'm relaxing by watching the first game of the 1985 season, a Monday night affair where the Cowboys just destroyed Super Bowl champion Washington Redskins. And the past is a foreign country, man. You watch that game, and the two color commentators are O.J. Simpson and Joe Namath, and the way they talk about how it's absolutely essential that the defense just beat up on the opposition quarterback, and there are just all sorts of things that they say that are just completely socially unacceptable today. And right, you just enter back into 1985. I was 19, and you just realize how foreign the past was compared to today. So one of the key things to understanding any writing, any art, any law is to understand when it was produced, for whom was it produced, what was the ideology behind the production, what was going on at that time and place. So this video was made in December of 2020.
Youth studied in Baranovich. Then in Baranovich, which is also Lita, they didn't study Torah, but that was a yeshiva. It had Hasidic young people in it, so that's different. So in Lithuania, you wouldn't study Torah. But once you move into the Hasidic world, this was pretty universal. There are other for example, the Munkacher, Chaim Ozer Shapiro, no relation to me.
So if you're not a traditional Jew, this will seem unfathomable, but the greatest delight, the highest virtue in traditional Judaism is to study Torah. And so to have a night without studying Torah, where instead you engage in recreational activities, is really hard to understand, because normally recreational activities are seen as Bitul Torah, time taken from the study of Torah. One of my favorite columnists is Thomas Edsall. He's a man of the left. He's often quite thoughtful. And this week he came out with a real humdinger. The MAHA, meaning the Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA pipe dream is going to hurt MAGA the most. Right?
The MAHA pipe dream is going to hurt MAGA the most. This article is by Thomas B. Edsall and read by an automated voice. The Trump administration has adopted policies condemning a sizable group of its core MAGA supporters, miners, firemen, manufacturing workers, to slow deaths from diseases that cut off their ability to breathe. President Trump's attacks on the regulation of toxic chemicals in the air and water, on strong vaccination policies, and on rules restricting power plant pollution are part and parcel of what amounts to a killing spree cloaked as deregulation. Take just one example, albeit a major one.
So do you remember a few months into COVID when some red states started to open up from lockdowns, and the elite media described these policies as essentially a slaughter, a killing spree?
Medical and public health experts estimate that the Trump administration's decision to eliminate nearly all assistance provided by the U.S. Agency for International Development will result in an estimated additional 14 million dead worldwide by
Remember, this same public health establishment said people should socially distance until George Floyd riots came along, and then they said it was a public health necessity. It was the righteous thing to do. It was to get out and publicly protest because it was for a good anti-racism cause. So the public health establishment blew its credibility with much of the population, who then ceased to listen to it.
2030. Add to this the estimates of rising numbers of preventable deaths in the United States from increased rates of respiratory.
So I think the dominant liberal elites often have very important, sharp, and accurate critiques of the lack of competence on behalf of the Trump administration.
Disease, illnesses of the unvaccinated, and elevated exposure to toxic chemicals and lethal pollutants emanating from coal-powered plants.
So by and large, I think our elites were right with regard to COVID, not in their promotion of social distancing, but then the opposite of that when it came to the George Floyd riots. But in general, social distancing was the right policy to push before we had vaccines. Once we got vaccines, pushing people to get vaccinated, I think was the right thing to do. I think overall our elites did better than expected with regard to the challenge of COVID. So I tend to the conventional perspective on COVID.
All of it enabled by Trump's deregulatory policies. Experts in healthcare don't hold back in their assessments of the Trump administration. My overall sense is that Trump is the worst president on health we have had, David M. Cutler, a professor of applied economics at Harvard, wrote by email in reply to my inquiries. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, Cutler noted, will lead to less insurance coverage and consequently health losses. The most recent estimates are 10 million uninsured. The ACA subsidies, if not extended, are projected to reduce insurance coverage by another 4 million.
So I love how the elite media talks about loss of health coverage or lack of health insurance as meaning people won't get medical care. But anyone can walk into an emergency room. If you break your leg or break your arm, you will get care. And the evidence that expanding health insurance saves lives is quite dicey.
Natasha Sarin at Yale reviewed the literature and concluded that 16 million uninsured would result in 140,000 deaths over a decade. Based on that,
so there is good reason to doubt those statistics. So it feels to me that Edsel may be engaging here in a classic maneuver of elite liberalism. He's trying to depoliticize a political conflict by framing it as a neutral matter of public health and safety. So he wants to define Trump policies as not just wrong, but a killing spree and a battle to the death. So he's trying to move the conflict beyond debate into the realm of existential threat. So the friends are the credentialed experts, the professors from Harvard and Yale, who wield data as a shield. And the enemy is not just Trump, it's the whole populist movement itself, which is portrayed as irrationally suicidal. So this New York Times columnist is trying to create a moral hierarchy where the managerial class represents life, represents science, truth, longevity, safety, and the populace and the dissident right, they represent death, pollution, disease, ignorance. So this justifies the total exclusion of the opposition from legitimate discourse, right? One does not debate a killing spree. One neutralizes it.
One would forecast 122,000 deaths from 14 million uninsured. This is obviously subject to uncertainty, but the direction is clear. The administration's anti-vaccine policies, Cutler continued, will result in more deaths. We are now experiencing diseases that we thought we had eliminated. Along similar lines, Benjamin Summers, a professor of healthcare economics at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
So overall, healthcare doesn't add much to people's lives, right? What saves people's lives are garbage collectors, right? Sanitation. Those are the big factors in extending life expectancy. So Thomas Edsall and the experts he cites measure human life through these thin universalist metrics like life expectancy, decimal points, vaccination percentages, insurance coverage rates. Right? These are the concerns of the elite. They are abstract, they're transferable, they're managed by bureaucracy. Now, contrast this with the thick identity of the miner or the Appalachian worker. Right? Their identity is rooted in place, tradition, a specific way of life that values autonomy and loyalty over mere biological longevity. So Edsall asks, why do these voters support a man whose policies might statistically shorten their lives? But he misses the point that for a thick culture, the preservation of their way of life, their people, their instinctive defiance against a despised elite, their desire for economic autonomy outweighed the thin goal of maximizing their lifespan by an additional 0.24 lives. Right? Some people choose a specific quality of life, with it autonomy and loyalty, over the quantity of life offered by the managerial state.
Health, wrote by email, the Trump administration is aggressively rolling back decades of progress in expanding health insurance and improving prevention through vaccination, which will lead to financial strain, barriers to care, and preventable deaths for many.
So behind these words, listen to the psychology of the elite class, right? The insulated, credential elite cannot comprehend why these losers do not want to be saved, right? There's this palpable sense of paternalistic frustration in Thomas Edsall's writing. He's marshalling an army of experts to mathematically prove that the working class is voting against its own biological interests, but he's ignoring the winner-loser feedback loop. Right? The experts cited are the winners of the current system, who trust institutions, right? Because these institutions validate their status. The losers, the Trump base, experience these same institutions as engines of their own displacement through globalization, opioid crisis, and cultural marginalization. So for the losers, right, defying the experts is a psychological victory in itself. It's a way to assert agency against a system that views them merely as data points to be managed. So the emergence of Robert Kennedy represents a collapse of the old distinct alt-right brand into something broader, messier, and populist. Right? A lowbrow resistance against the dominant elite. Right? It's a crunchy anti-establishment skepticism and right-wing populism that helped to elect Donald Trump. So Thomas Edsall sees a contradiction, but you can also view it as a coherent alignment against the administrative state. So in a high-trust society like Australia, the government tends to be viewed as a neutral arbiter of fairness. In America, the government is often viewed as a hostile occupier, and so dismantling the administrative state, even the parts that save lives like OSHA or the CDC, is viewed not as a loss of protection, but as a liberation from a hostile power.
Americans. Summers made his own calculation of the number of deaths he expected to result from the health care cuts in Medicaid in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the rising costs of policies available in the Obamacare marketplace.
So this Thomas Edsall essay is perfect for illustrating the disconnection between the two Americas. Right? Edsall wants to use the language of the thin elite world of statistics and health outcomes to shame the thick world into compliance. He fails to see that for populists, right, this war on public health is a war on the authority of the public health class. Right? The voters he describes as are ignorant, not aware of the risk, right? But they despise the people offering the cure more than they fear the disease. Right? The statistical claims in Edsall's piece are sturdy only if you accept the central truth and the methodology of the managerial class. Right? They rely on these quite thin observational studies to produce large dramatic numbers that they then use for political bludgeoning. Right? If you look at this data behind their bludgeoning, right, it's quite shallow. Right? The notion that extending Medicaid doesn't save lives, right, that's grounded in the most rigorous study ever conducted on the topic. So we have a battle of methodologies here, observation versus experiment. Thomas Edsall presents a terrifying claim that repealing the ACA or cutting Medicaid will kill 140,000 people, but he relies on observational, low-quality studies. Right? You can't fully adjust for cultural reality. Right? He's using models that attribute broad improvements in life expectancy to some one single government program. Right? The counter-evidence comes from the Oregon experiment. In 2008, Oregon used a lottery to give Medicaid to some poor people and not to others. They created a perfect randomized scientific experiment. After 2 years, study found zero statistical significant improvement in physical health for those who got Medicaid compared to those who don't. So sure, Medicaid improved financial security. It acted as a wealth transfer, but it wasn't a health cure. It didn't save lives. Edsel ignores this gold standard evidence because it contradicts his battle to the death narrative.
If you take Congressional Budget Office's number for the OBBBA, combined with the effect of letting the enhanced marketplace subsidies expire after 2025, about 16 million people become uninsured, about half Medicaid and half marketplace. Summers estimated in an earlier paper that Medicaid expansion prevented 1 death per year for every 239 to 316 adults gaining Medicaid. In reverse, this would imply that the Medicaid cuts could cause between 24,000 to 32,000 deaths per year.
So, in Thomas Edsel's views, health, right, your health, that's a metric to be managed by the experts, by the state. It's to be measured by vaccination rates and insurance cards and funding levels. And if these numbers go up, health is happening. Right, the view of the populace, the dissidents, right, health is an outcome of high quality of life, of social cohesion, purpose, and a way of life that fills you with meaning. Right, and the deaths of despair in the Rust Belt from drug, suicide, alcohol, they are driven by the loss of thick identity, community, jobs, and status, not driven by the lack of a thin insurance card. Right, giving some despairing unemployed coal miner a Medicaid card does not solve the spiritual crisis that's killing him. So Edsel thinks the card is the solution because he cannot measure the despair. So the expert consensus that he cites is constructed by selecting a particular methodology that favors his politics, that produces the most politically useful numbers, while ignoring the overwhelming evidence that suggests government health insurance is largely a financial product, not a life-saving device.
Similarly, Summers and his colleagues found that when Massachusetts expanded health coverage in a precursor to the Affordable Care Act, there was 1 death prevented for every 830 adults gaining it.
There was an economist, Ronald Coase, who said that if you just torture the data enough, you can come up with anything you want.
He had additional practices, it's recorded. So, for instance, not only did he not study Torah, he wouldn't receive requests from a Chassidim. Kvitlech, he couldn't do that. But he tells us that from midnight, chatzos, everything resumes normal. And that seems to be the unanimous practice. So let's remember that, because this is going to be important later when we come to just figure out what's going on here. The practices we're going to be speaking about only go to midnight. He also says, well, one practice, with an exception of one practice. The Munkacher says that there should be no sexual relations tonight, including after midnight, with the exception if it's the mikveh night.
So in Seventh-day Adventism, I would hear you shouldn't have sex on the Sabbath, while in Judaism, having sex on the Sabbath, meaning husband and wife, it's considered a holy deed.
And this is not unusual because when it comes to sexual relations, we'll come back to this maybe later, it seems to be the practice that the entire night until morning is verboten, and some even include a mikvah night from this. What about if tonight is Shabbos? Sometimes.
So mikveh refers to the time period after a woman's period has ceased, after the wife's period has finished, and then you count 7 days, you go to the mikveh, and then you can rejoin marital relations with your spouse.
Nittel coincides with Shabbos. There you have a dispute. Some people think that even Friday night, not only is there no learning, the Rebbe can't have a tish where he says Torah and all those sorts of things. But others hold that no, the power of Shabbos is able to overcome the evil forces of Nittel, and therefore you can learn Friday night. Okay, so what are the reasons, though? Let me first turn to the Chasam Sofer. The very fact that I mentioned the Chasam Sofer, Rav Moshe Sofer, great Rav of Pressburg, shows you that this has nothing to do with the Hasidim. Or else the Chasam Sofer wouldn't have anything to do with this. But in the Chasam Sofer, he comes from Frankfurt, and they did not study Torah on Nittel in Frankfurt. So you see, it has nothing to do with Hasidim. We're going to see later when we can date this practice. He tells us that he heard from his teacher, the great Rav Nosson Adler of Frankfurt, and then of Boskowitz, and then returns to Frankfurt. If you go today, you can see his tombstone in the Frankfurt cemetery. What happened was he created problems in the community with his unusual practices. They actually put him in Chayrim, even though
So Orthodox Judaism tends to promote conformity. And the more intense your Orthodox Jewish identity, right, the more incentivized you are to conform with that which is socially acceptable. Marc Shapiro is an incredibly courageous scholar, and he's willing to relay all sorts of unpopular truths because he has great internal courage.
He was one of the Gedolei Yisrael. He had to leave, but when he comes back towards the end of his life, they lift the Cherem, and he's able to be buried with everyone else. But when he was forced to leave Frankfurt, the Chassam Sofer, his student, followed him to Boskowitz today in the Czech Republic. And the Chassam Sofer says, or Nosson Adler says, that the reason Jews do not learn tonight is because Jews are in Avelut, mourning. He doesn't say what he means by this, but it's obvious, because all the suffering that Jews had encountered and had gone through due to the birth of Jesus. That is, we've been persecuted for 1900 years in Jesus' name. Therefore,
so up until the 18th century, the fortunes of Judaism and Christianity went in opposite directions, right? The stronger Christianity was, the worse it was for Jews. The better situated, more confident Jews were, right? That usually reflected significant weakness in Christianity. But with the Enlightenment, the fates of religious Christians and religious Jews started to run in parallel, beginning in the late 18th century.
Or we don't learn tonight because learning Torah gives you joy, just like you're not allowed to learn on when you're in Avil. It's the same thing, or Tisha B'Av for that matter. And the Chassam Sofer says, well, on the one hand, this explains why there's no sexual relations tonight. In fact, the Chassam Sofer tells us that he used to close the mikvah in Europe, just like on Tisha.
So the more intense your in-group Jewish identity, the more you will connect with Jewish suffering, and in all likelihood, the more negative feelings you'll have about out-groups, just as if you have an intense black, white, Mexican, American, Japanese, American, Italian identity, the more you'll connect and feel deeply the suffering of your people, and the more likely you will be to have negative feelings about out-groups.
Tisha B'Av, when all this is forbidden. But the Chassam Sofer rejects this approach, even though this was a popular practice in his day. He says that the custom of abstaining from sexual relations and closing the mikveh, he calls it a minhag shtus, a foolish custom, which should be abolished. And he says, you know why we don't study Torah? It has nothing to do with, firstly, since it was due with mourning, Avelos, then it wouldn't end at midnight. Who ever heard of it ending at midnight? It would be the whole day. Second of all, he says, what do you mean? So we know you can't learn Torah, but it's not exactly correct. There's lots of things. You could spend a whole year if you just focused on the things you're allowed to learn on Tisha B'Av and on when you're in Avel. There's Gemaras that you can learn, halachas you can learn. You can learn the book of Eov. I mean, there's plenty you can learn. But yet we don't do anything. We play cards. They used to cut toilet paper for the coming Shabbos. All sorts of crazy things they used to do. So what is the Chassam Sofer says? He doesn't accept this. Even though Nosson Adler wasn't a real halachic of Egos, he gives a different reason. He says, you know something? That if Jews were to study, like we usually do, study till you get tired, 11:30, midnight, whatever, and then you go to sleep, this would reflect badly in heaven against us. Why? Because we're always up later than non-Jews. We're studying Torah, and they go to sleep. But this is the one day a year where they're up, midnight mass. If they would be up doing their religious ceremony in the church and we'd be sleeping, the Satan could say, oh, look at this. The non-Jews are serving God, or their God, and the Jews are asleep. So the Chassam Sofer says, therefore, the practice developed, although it was distorted, but this is the origin of the practice. Jews would go to sleep now, and then we'd wake up at midnight so that when they're doing their practices, we're learning. Okay, it's definitely not the authentic reason, but that's the reason he gave. Notice that it doesn't have any of the supernatural elements we've seen and we will see. His explanation is entirely utilitarian. It's also significant that he doesn't see anything wrong with sleeping until midnight, although it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't have studied. But he says this is what you should do. There's another explanation offered for the practice. And this is offered by a 19th century maskil called Eliezer Zweifel. According to Zweifel, in medieval times, there was an increased danger for Jews venturing out on Christmas Eve, and therefore the rabbis ordained that everyone was to stay home tonight. In other words, people didn't go to the base medrash; it was dangerous, and therefore that's why people didn't learn. Now, this became a very popular explanation, and people don't realize it was stated by a maskil. I want to show you where this appears, because this is going to be important. It appears in this book, Likutei Tzvi. I discovered this completely by accident, and I found the answer to a mystery that for many decades, if not many decades, well over 100 years, no one was able to solve it, and it was just by accident. It's amazing what sometimes either accident or shkocha pratis. Well, I'll explain to you in a minute. Zweifel was a maskil. He had a more positive attitude towards Hasidim than other maskilim, but he's maskil. And this book that he edited, it says Divrei Torah v'Chachma. Where do you see the word Chachma? Chachma means, this is Lithuanian maskilim, so they're more traditional. But in the back of this, he has his own notes. And he gives this reason, what I call a rational reason. And it became very popular. Why did it become popular? Because there's a book called Tamei HaMinhagim, which gives all the Hasidic and other customs. And in the book Tamei HaMinhagim, it quotes this explanation. And it quotes it in the name of a book, Likutei Pardes. There's only one such book, Likutei Pardes, and that's a book of material from Rashi in his school. It's actually Likutei Pardes. This explanation entered the Jewish world because of the Tamei Minhagim. Now, everyone who writes about this practice, they all cite Likutei Pardes. Very few of them actually tell you that where they got it from, the Tamei Minhagim. If they would look at Likutei Pardes, you'd see it's not there in Likutei Pardes, nowhere there. So you see the people who are lifting it without even bother looking. Then you have some who cite it Likutei Pardes in the name of Tamei Minhagim and say, but I looked for it and didn't find it. The fact is, it's just either a typo, or maybe the author of Tamei Minhagim didn't want to say where he really got it from, so he's hinting. He didn't want to say Likutei Tzvi because that's Haskalah work. But he gives this Likutei Pardes. But this is a rational explanation. Of course, look at all the problems it raises. So you're not supposed to go out? Well, that means that you shouldn't go to shul? We never heard of such a thing where people didn't go to davening on Nitto. You're not supposed to learn at home? Fine, you can't go to the base medrash. What about learning at home? But they didn't learn at home either. So people just confused it. They said, don't come to the base medrash. You can come to the base medrash to daven, but you can't stay to learn. And when you go home, you have to play cards. So people would get together and play cards. The whole explanation has problems with it. But this is a common explanation. Gedol Yisrael said this explanation. My friend of mine asked Rav Aaron Soloveitchik about Nitto. And lo and behold, he gave him the Likutei Tzvi. He just said, because it used to be dangerous, so you can ignore it. I'm not saying that it always was the safest thing on Christmas Eve, but Jews lived in their towns, and there are often even ghettos surrounded by, non-Jews didn't come in at night. They would often go wherever they want. It wasn't such a terrible thing. Easter, in fact, was often much more problematic, but there were bad things sometimes that happened on Christmas Eve. For example, the Dinover. Ritzi Elimelech of Dinov tells in one of his Sfarim that it once happened that a number of people got together to learn on Nittel. That is, they weren't paying attention, that you're not supposed to learn. And what happened? A dog appeared in front of their house. I'm assuming when he says a dog, he doesn't mean a nice little fluffy dog. He means like a mean-looking dog. So you might say, so what? Well, you have to understand that this is to be viewed in the context of the popular Kabbalistic identification of Jesus with a dog. That is, when Kelev is used, it refers in various connotations to Jesus. And actually, the gematria, the numerical value of Kelev, is 52, which is the same as Ben, son. And Jesus represents the Son. The Christians called him the Son of God, but he's really the Son from the impure side. So the word Ben, Kelev, with the same gematria, allude in Kabbalistic writings to using the word Ben as the Christians do it, but the Ben of the Sitra Achra, with all the impure forces. Now, but all this is in the realm of the supernatural. It has nothing to do with the practical explanation offered by Zweifel. In fact, if you look before this stuff about the dog, the Dinover has a whole piece about Jesus' name. He claims that the reason people don't learn tonight is because, and he thinks it's on the day of Jesus' death, he thinks it's due to the klipa. the impure forces associated with Jesus. Let me go on. Let's leave Zweifel's explanation aside for the reasons I mentioned. When I first was interested in this is in the 1990s, the late 1990s, I started getting interested in this custom. And I asked myself, since Zweifel's explanation doesn't make any sense, we have no evidence that Jews ever did not go to synagogue, that synagogue was closed, that people were never told not to learn at home, people were never told that at home you should learn. I thought there must be other reasons. And I have all these strange reasons in the Hasidic world. We'll get to some of them, but non-rational reasons. Let me just give you some. According to Chabad text, for instance, the reason you refrain from learning Torah tonight is in order to not to increase the vitality, the use of the klipos. What this means is that when we learn Torah, we create powerful spiritual forces, I would say. The demonic, the impure side, is also very powerful tonight because the Christians are praying. And the demonic side could latch on to these powerful spiritual forces that we have let out and invert the positive spiritual forces to the dark side. That's
So right now the Ashes is going on. Australia won the first 3 of 5 Test cricket matches, and the English supporters who came to Australia for this series, they are known as the Barmy Army. Barmy meaning mad, and they begin every day's play by spontaneously singing Jerusalem, that hymn.
Anti
right, can't beat that. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.